Anthony Tony Stark. To the world at large, he is a wealthy industrialist, brilliant inventor, daring futurist, jet-setting playboy. Yet beneath the debonair facade beats the heart of a man humbled by loss and tragedy, a man whose genius has found new purpose in the wake of that loss as a visionary in the service of human potential and a vigilant protector of humanity itself. Tony Stark is the Invincible Iron Man.
This is Comic Geek Speak, episode 1623. Spotlight on the Invincible Iron Man.
And welcome to the show.
doesn't
I'm
get
Brian
better than that
Chrisman.
theme. I'm Shane Kelly.
It's just like it's like cocktail jazz. It's like the Manhattan Transfer should have recorded a version of that.
And you are?
I'm Adam Murdo. Hi.
And I'm Chris Eberle.
I actually did I thought a bit of a Rod Serling reading.
That's
of
what
that.
I was thinking of too. That was totally
Happy
right.
Imagine a
Came
man.
across.
Imagine a man.
We have to
Consider if
forgive
you
Murray. It's
will.
the first
Imagine.
time he's heard that theme. So
Imagine.
I can
Earth
understand how he's
616.
tongue-tied by it.
Stunned,
I've heard
in
a
fact.
lot of cartoon themes. I've never heard that one.
That's Iron Man.
Obviously, it's an earworm.
Iron Man.
All right. Well,
And
welcome.
the bar is open.
We've already lost control. All right. Well, welcome to our spotlight on the Invincible Iron Man in the Silver Age. Once again, with Chris Eberle at the helm.
Honored, sir.
Again, it was his baby. We've got copious notes here.
Do they always have to be copious?
They do. Looking forward to the discussion. Before we even get started, a word from our sponsor.
Okay, which is our friends at the Collection Drawer Company, the proud manufacturers of the Drawer Box Storage System, which is an improvement on the classic cardboard long box for the storage of comic books. The big difference is, instead of having a lid that lifts off the top to access the contents that way, you can access the contents by pulling a drawer nested into, it's one box nested inside of another, like an outer shell. Pull it forward to access the comics that way you don't have to unstack stacks of long boxes to access the contents in the box on the bottom of said stack. It's much more convenient, much more accessible, and it tends to be much more stable when you're stacking the boxes several high. So they manufacture the drawer box, and they also manufacture a variety of accessories to go with it, such as the box locks anchors to improve the stability for partially full boxes and prevent box tipping. There are also dividers available. The box sort upright dividers, which prevent the contents of the drawer boxes from falling over, protects the spines from cracking, and it makes it easier to create sections for different titles within a single box. And the drawer boxes are available in a variety of sizes and shapes, so you can store not only comic books, but magazines, sewing supplies, action figures, LP records, and more. For full details, you can check their website at collectiondrawer.com. Ask about their volume discounts, because they are aware at the Collection Drawer Company that the collector attempting to rehouse their collections in drawer boxes will need to buy several drawer boxes at a time to accomplish that task, so volume discounts are available. Check the collectiondrawer.com, their website, for more details.
Excellent.
Masterfully done, brother. Masterfully done.
You're too kind, Chris.
Nonsense.
Literally, I was babbling.
That's always good for the sponsor to hear.
Well, after that bravura performance, as you said, as a Rod Serling type doing that was fantastic.
That was totally Rod Serling.
All right. Well, Chris, once again, you have done yeoman's work for this. You've done the research. You've actually sent us some images for the YouTube video of this episode. We will drop in covers and some very interesting panels from this era.
Oh, yes.
But yeah, I guess we should start out with how we came into the character. Is that?
Yeah, let's first talk about why I decided to do this.
Oh,
at this
certainly,
time.
absolutely.
And then we'll go to our customary initial reflections, as you mentioned.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking about, all right, what spotlight do I want to do next? And I realized we've talked about Iron Man in the Avengers spotlight. We've never given him his own spotlight treatment. I don't think you guys did it the first time we did spotlights years ago, right?
We certainly did
no,
not.
Okay. And I was thinking, well, Iron Man is so huge in our popular culture because of the wonderful job Robert Downey Jr. has done portraying that character. And in many ways, Iron Man is basically the focal point of the Marvel Cinematic Universe. It was the first film. It was extremely successful. And think about how many times Stark has appeared in all these movies. I mean, he's one of the core characters of the whole unfolding saga, essentially. And I was just talking to Shane before about how it's to the point now when I read Iron Man comics, I tend to reflexively hear Downey Jr.'s voice now when I'm reading Tony Stark. You know, when you read a comic book or any kind of fiction, your mind automatically creates a voice for all the different characters.
Sure.
You often can't recreate it when you're speaking out loud, but in your mind it all makes sense. And I find Downey Jr. is there more and more now when I'm reading Iron Man.
I will not let him in.
That's fair, and I'm not saying it's a good thing necessarily, but it's happening, and that's a credit to the caliber of his performance, his rendering of that character. And I wanted to take some time to go back to where it all began, right, and to really look at what makes Iron Man such a compelling character, such a mainstay in the Marvel Universe, and also to sort of also look at maybe at the end of our discussion how that's carried over into these movies, which have done so well, especially the first one, I would say. So we'll be looking at the Silver Age origins of the character. We'll be looking at, you know, the creative forces behind that character, Lee, Kirby, Ditko, and I want to spend some real time talking about the greatness of Don Heck, who often gets overlooked when people talk about the early history of Marvel Comics, the Marvel Age, so to speak. And then, of course, I want to also spend some time looking at the armor from the Silver Age, because you could do a whole episode just on the history of Iron Man's armor.
Yeah.
And frankly, I'm not even qualified to do. I'd have to do so much reading to do that because there's so many iterations of his armor.
There have been entire books, or comic book length books
Exactly.
anyway, just about the armor and the different schematics.
Exactly.
The
I mean,
Iron Manual, they call it.
Well done, sir. We're just going to focus on the Silver Age, and there's several models just in the Silver Age alone of that armor. And then, of course, we're going to do our typical checklist. I look forward to Professor Murdo holding forth on some of the classic villains that are introduced. Remember, as we talked about in our Thor spotlight, well, a lot of the fun of looking at all the early Marvel Silver Age stuff is all the great villains and supporting characters are introduced in all of these various series. And now they all tend to cross over, of course, which is when the Marvel Universe is working at its best into other characters' series. Let's begin now with our initial reflections on the character. Shane, would you like to begin, my friend?
I'm sitting right here.
And yet he went across the room. Iron Man is probably my second favorite Marvel hero after Spider-Man. And part of that's because he's very, in especially my young age, very Bruce Wayne-ish, very rich, very gadgety. I mean, it's a whole suit, but it's got a lot of different things that happen and that he can do with the suit.
It's got whatever a writer wants to put in there.
Yeah, yeah, and it makes it work. I never thought the comic book character of Tony Stark was as much of an ass as what the movie tended to portray him as in the beginning. But the movie has done a great job of making it able to enjoy his transformation into what he becomes. And the comic books do that too. I just always found it very fascinating for him being just a man and can still create all this stuff and still be the hero and still keep up with everybody else, just like Batman can on the Justice League. That's what Iron Man does for me with the Avengers. He makes everyday man possible to be a hero.
Well put, brother. Pantaloons?
Well, it's interesting that everybody, for the most part nowadays, thinks of Robert Downey Jr. We think of Iron Man. When I think of Iron Man, before that, I thought of Timothy Dalton.
Yeah, I did too.
Because
yeah,
of
that
Alex
makes sense.
Ross and Mark Waid, especially Alex Ross drawing him in Marvels, that wonderful homage to the Silver Age
yes.
of Marvel history.
Yeah.
I see you brought along, thank goodness, the Son of Origins of Marvel Comics. That's, I believe, where I first became aware of Iron Man, read his origin in Tales of Suspense 39. And the other story was, I think, Tales of Suspense 97
Yes.
with Whiplash, I
We'll
believe.
be talking about that, yep.
So I read about that. In the 70s, I might have had a comic or two of Iron Man. Don't remember much about that, and really didn't get into reading his comics probably until the movies came out, because I wasn't a big Marvel reader. So I am very curious, and I love this age of Marvel Comics with these characters who didn't have their own titles, but were in the anthologies, Tales of Suspense.
Oh yes.
We mentioned with a Thor, Journey into Mystery, things like that. So I'm very. I have a lot of these, I think, in the Marvel Masterworks, but I don't think I've actually read through them all. I actually have Tales of Suspense 57, first Hawkeye. I actually bought that issue at Comic-Con, I think, like 3 years ago. So I've read that, but the other stuff, I'm oblivious to. I know tidbits here and there, so as with most of these spotlights, I'm just going to be an observer, might throw in a comment or a question every now and then. But I'm very much looking forward to this and learning more about his Silver Age history.
Pansy, no one asks questions better.
Well, I'm sure people do, but
I look forward to them.
no, certainly.
Murdo the Magnificent.
Hi-oh!
No pressure there. Up to that kind of hype. No, I'm in the presence of magnificence. I can but reflect it back to you.
My wife would be laughing at you right now. Anyway,
Yes, I'm sure.
Oh, I'm laughing too. You just don't hear it.
On the inside. Okay, well, I first learned about Iron Man from looking at our friend Matt's Marvel Universe trading cards. It's pretty
It all
like
goes
a
back to
broken
trading
record.
cards.
Yes, it always does. I can remember, I saw a few images of what his Iron Man armor looked like at that time, and I remember laughing out loud when I saw they did a sub-series of the first series of Marvel Universe trading cards about famous first appearances, and there was an image of Tales of Suspense number 39's cover there, and I laughed out loud when I saw what the Mark I armor looked like, so big and bulky and clunky compared to the much sleeker red and gold armor he was sporting by the time those cards were produced. And I also knew about him from one brief appearance he made on the Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends animated series in the 80s.
I remember that. Yeah.
Yes, with the Beetle. It was going
Okay.
after Stark's famous Power Booster, which actually had the words Power Booster printed on it in large letters.
How else would you know what it is?
That's true.
Come on.
Can't argue with that. What engineer could? Yeah, so, and I first read a couple of appearances of his in the 90s. Those were the first actual Iron Man comics I read. It was around the time when James Rhodes first donned the War Machine armor,
Okay.
when he believed Tony Stark was dead, or shortly after he learned that Tony Stark wasn't actually dead, but had faked his own death and hadn't even told Rhodey about it. And yeah, so right in the middle of that whole soap opera business, that was those were the first Iron Man comics I ever read, and I thought the armor design of War Machine was cool, but didn't exactly get drawn into Iron Man's world that way. Truth to tell, I shouldn't say that. Iron Man as a costumed identity has never been one of my favorites in comics. It's just too technologically oriented, and I am not a technologically oriented person myself. Gadgetry bores me.
Really?
Morning! Oh, excuse me.
Yeah, I'll take magic over machinery any day of the week. So if I was really more invested in our Thor spotlight a little while ago. But that said, I will say that Tony Stark, as distinct from Iron Man, is one of the more interesting personalities in the Marvel Comics
I
universe.
concur wholeheartedly, sir.
He's just kind of a damaged, conflicted, tragic figure. And I never really. I'm glad that you've decided to make one of the main themes here the distinctions and or similarities between the cinematic Tony Stark as played by Robert Downey Jr. and the version that we actually saw beginning in the 1960s in the comics, because to me, although I like what Robert Downey Jr. and also the screenwriters of those Iron Man movies did with the character, that Tony Stark is interesting in his own right, but it's not the Tony Stark that I don't ever hear Robert Downey Jr.'s voice. Certainly not when I read older Iron Man comics. Newer ones, like more recent appearances of the character in Marvel Comics, they're clearly written to the
I
cadences
think that's a fair observation, yeah.
of the RDJ version of the character, and it kind of pains me that that's what the character has now become in the comics as well as in the movies. But yeah, I think of him more as like a cross between James Bond and Howard Hughes. Like the way he was written back
Well,
in
Lee
the 60s
talks about
and
Howard
70s.
Hughes' influence all the time when he talks about the creation of the characters.
Yeah, but this, the suavité and the secret life of action and intrigue that he lives, that's kind of Bond to me. So, kind of a combination of those two, and then of course the additional Marvel tragic flaw of the damage to his heart.
All got to have their Achilles heel.
Yep. So it's an interesting brew that was put together here when Tony Stark was first created, and he only became more layered and more complex and tragic as the decades wore on. And nowadays he's practically, thanks to the Robert Downey Jr. version, he's practically on the autistic spectrum with some of his personality defects and social quirks. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to going back to the roots of the character and getting into some of the nitty-gritty of it with you, Chris, who understand the Silver Age of Iron Man far better than I do.
I don't know about that, brother, but
Oh, I do.
I look forward to sharing the journey with you. For me, as with a lot of the Marvel characters, my introduction wasn't in comics first, it was in other media.
Okay.
So for Iron Man, it was Underoos.
Oh, yes.
Okay.
It
Oh,
was,
the Mego figure. I forgot about the
was-
Mego figure.
How could you forget the Mego figure?
And of course, I loved how they made a fool of him in the Wizard comics in the Toy Fair magazines. But anyway.
Yeah,
Come on, with the striped trunks as the armor? Come
Well,
on.
they used the whole drunk thing a lot in all the.
But the Mego toy,
Oh, yeah.
the Marvel Metal lunchbox I had was in the store.
Yes.
And first and foremost, though, for me, this is late 70s on WPIX. They were playing the 1966 Iron Man cartoon with Hulk, Submariner, Thor, and Captain America. And that was the first time I really saw Iron Man in action, so to speak. Not that there was much action in those animated shorts.
Yes.
But that was my real first. Those are examples of how I was first exposed to the character. Then I got, for Christmas, my copy of Son of Origins.
I love that book.
And,
oh my gosh. Yes.
I have a picture in my house. It's got to be very early 80s. These books were in print for a while, so it was very early 80s because we all have the bad sweaters, and my dad has glasses this big and so forth. So it's the early 80s. And I'm proudly holding this book. I just opened it under my grandparents' Christmas tree, and I'm holding it sheepishly in front of the camera like this.
Don't knock the microphone.
Oh, sorry there, Tootsie.
Professionalism out the window.
And this is the first Iron Man comics I actually read. So I read Tales of Suspense 39. I was automatically struck, as Murd mentioned, by how different the armor was in that first appearance than what I was accustomed to and I saw in the cartoon and in merchandise and so forth. And then I was blown away by the Tales of Suspense 97 because, again, that was some of my early exposure to Gene Colan artwork, who remains one of my all-time favorite artists in comics, without question. And I was automatically taken with a lot of the elements we've been discussing, sort of the espionage aspects to it, the industrial intrigue, and just the way Colan rendered the armor. Like, to me, the armor you see in Tales of Suspense 97, that's kind of like, to me, like definitive Iron Man armor. When I think of Iron Man armor, I think of, the armor from the late 60s and 70s with the pods on the side of his belt with the extra energy and, like, the plug they can put into a socket to restore his power, which is hilarious, and just that classic red and gold with the gauntlets and the repulsor rays. And we're not going to get into the 70s this episode, but then of course you get to the nose on the face plate, which is just majestically goofy. But even as a young kid, I really was intrigued by a character who was in so many ways had the perfect life. But yet, beneath all that, as Murd mentioned, was a very troubled and tragic figure. And we're gonna look at how in this episode how Tony Stark, even in these early stories, and they really run with this in the modern era. I think like the classic Matt Fraction stuff from in recent years. Even in these early issues, Tony Stark has a lot of issues. I just used the word issues twice in a sentence. Sorry about that. But even when we get into the kind of the goofy love triangle between him and Pepper and Happy. Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan, a lot of that's he feels like I can't be with somebody because I could die at any moment because my heart is like a ticking time bomb, essentially. And obviously they can't go into all the psychological ramifications of these early stories because of the time period and the audience, but when you think about how Stark tends to treat women throughout his life, a lot of it goes back to, and a lot of this was retconned later, of course, his family, his origins, his afflictions, his ailments. I think he's one of the most fascinating, and to piggyback what you said, one of the most fascinating, forget even Iron Man, just people in the Marvel Universe, just Tony Stark himself. And a skilled writer, like a Matt Fraction, for example, gets so much mileage out of just the Tony Stark persona. Forget even him in the armor, just as Tony Stark. And I think the films really caught on to that, especially in the third one when they talk about what really makes him Iron Man, per se. Is it the armor, or is it just who he is as a person, essentially? And you see a lot of that even in these early stories, I think. So I'm really excited to talk about all the history behind this character, because when you read Marvel Comics today, I mean, he's the focal point, basically, of everything.
Yeah. Yeah.
the Civil War stories, pretty much every major event. Like, he is one of the key players. I mean, they've really, I mean, let's face it, a lot of it's because of these movies.
Oh, sure.
But they've elevated him to a point where pretty much anything that happens in the Marvel Universe, Tony Stark is often right at the center of it, essentially. So, yeah, it's overdue that we talk about him, I think, in a spotlight format. Now, we addressed him quite a bit in our Avengers spotlights. So we're not. So I'm glad talking to myself, I brought this up. We're not going to talk about it much about the Avengers here because we did a whole host of episodes on those. So go back to 2013 and 14, and you can hear all our Avengers spotlights. So we're going to focus on the Iron Man title in his solo career in the Silver Age, in these issues. So I'm honored and excited.
Yes.
To jump in. Now, just to let our listeners know how we're going to go about this, as I was doing my research and reading old stories or skimming them and going through my notes and so forth, I realized, my God, you could do a whole series of episodes just on the armor, which we can't do. I really don't have the time. Like that, you'd have to be like a scholar to really become really well versed in all of the different iterations of Iron Man's armor. So I said, all right, we're just going to kind of take a slice. We're just going to look at the Silver Age, the origins of the character, the creative forces behind the character, with a special attention to the great Don Heck. We'll talk a bit about just kind of Tony Stark in general, the persona. That kind of goes past the Silver Age, just because a lot of people are familiar with that. And we're going to talk about the armor, the Silver Age versions of the armor, because that's about as much time as we're going to have, because there's several models just in the 60s. And you know, there's major models and there's little tweaking he does. I mean, one of the great things about the stories is Stark is always working on the armor. He's always coming up with new weapons, new iterations of it, new designs, which is fascinating. And we'll talk, well, of course, we'll checklist all the key issues, as I mentioned earlier, and Murt's going to have a field day with this, some classic Marvel villains and supporting characters first appear in Tales of Suspense. And then we're going to look at just briefly, because I got to mention in Pants, did your yeoman's work. We started with that classic cocktail lounge theme. You can hear Bill Murray singing it in Saturday Night Live, for example, from the classic 1966 cartoon. Has anybody seen that besides me in the room?
I've maybe seen it once. I don't remember it per
That's
se.
okay. Because you know what? You have seen it because it's all these stories just photocopied and mildly animated. So we'll talk about that because that's other media. And then maybe we'll just reflect upon how do we feel the Silver Age renderings of this character have influenced this colossal multi-billion-dollar film franchise, essentially, which again, Tony Stark is at the center at. Think about almost all of those movies, he's in them, with a couple exceptions. He's in almost every one of the Marvel
Even in
films.
The Incredible Hulk.
Right at the end, yep, with Thunderbolt Ross.
It's fabulous.
Spoilers.
So,
Too bad.
that was, what year did that movie? Was that 2009, 10?
I think earlier than that. Well,
Yeah.
I'll look
Yeah,
at
just
it.
keep it moving.
Which
Don't
movie?
mind me.
Which
Just
one?
keep it moving.
Hulk.
Oh.
Incredible
All right,
Hulk.
so, Shane, if you could put up the cover to Tales of Suspense 39, please.
Okie dokie.
Thanks, Honey Pie. Now, the character first appears, as many of our listeners no doubt are aware, in Tales of Suspense 39, 1963, prior to the death of President John F. Kennedy. Now, this is not scripted by Stan Lee. He plotted the book. Now, we have to remember, Lee was art director, editor-in-chief, and at this early stage, writing virtually all the titles. So that's an incredible amount of, that's a lot of responsibilities, and one man can only do so much. So for whatever reason, it was crunch time. He passed off his plot to his brother, Larry Lieber, who was much younger than Stan Lee. And Lieber, Lieber's written, he wrote a lot of the Marvel Westerns. He wrote Iron Man, he wrote Thor. He's got quite a career in his own right. And Lieber scripts the first Iron Man appearance. Now, Jack King Kirby, as he was often called upon to do, did the cover, and therefore he designed the original Iron Man armor. That's his conception. And the book was penciled by another. There's like a triumvirate of artists at the beginning of the Marvel Age. Everybody knows Kirby and Ditko, but the other leg in that stool is Don Heck, who was already a long-established artist going back to the Atlas era. He did westerns, he did, you name it, romance. He's famous for his renderings of women in comics. very important creator who's often overlooked and I think underrated. And I want to give credit to John Coates from Tomorrow's. His book, Don Heck, A Work of Art, was one of my go-to research tools for this episode. So if you're interested in early Marvel history, Don Heck, definitely pick this book up. It's an outstanding resource.
Let me just also mention, of course, this is Iron Man is Born is the story in TOS 39. One of the other stories in Tales of Suspense 39, called The Last Rocket, was penciled by Gene Colan.
Was it under Gene Colan or Austin?
Adam Austin.
Adam Austin.
Yeah.
Was it Adam Austin?
Adam Austin,
Okay.
yeah.
We'll talk more about that in a moment.
Okay, well, I just thought that it was kind of interesting. In his first appearance, also in that same issue, there's Gene Colan artwork.
Pansy, as always.
Every now and
Clutch.
then, it pays to have me around.
Every now and then, my foot is consistent, brother.
Every now and then.
Now, have we all read Tales of Suspense 39?
It's been a while for me. I couldn't find my copies before the show, but yes,
Okay.
I've read it, yes.
Nerd, you've read it?
I'm pretty sure I
Did
have
you say
too.
no, Shane?
No.
Get out! How dare you? Been in the
There's
spotlight.
Keep your seat.
Plenty of
I know.
Silver Age stuff I have yet to read.
I kid. But it's the love in the room. Can you feel the love in the room, by the way? I'm sorry. Keep it going. Keep it going.
Now you gave it to me. Do you really
I
want me
did,
to
I
wax
did.
rhapsodic now on the love in this room?
Iron
I
Man
could go on for 2
39.
hours
Tales of
about
Suspense.
that. You know how
Don
excited I
Heck.
was that Shane was able to come to this episode? Come on. I'm with my brothers. All right, now. Okay, so the three of us have read the issue. I read it again just to, obviously, I more skimmed it just prior to this. And I just find it fascinating what a time capsule that story is of a particular era in the history of the United States.
Yeah, many of the early Marvels are.
Oh, absolutely. And let me read a quote. This is from Stan Lee. This is in The Son of Origins. As no doubt many listeners know, and I'll hold this up, Fireside did a series of books in the mid-1970s, and through the decade, actually, where they contracted Stan Lee to write his version, which always has to be emphasized, of the creation of the Marvel Universe. And there's essays written in his inimitable style, which I automatically fell in love with even as a kid because it was just so bombastic and cheerful and personable. My vocabulary is because of two people, my grandfather and Stan Lee. Inglenook, baby. Now, but what's great about these books is all the reprints, because there were no real reprint trades in the set. Like, this was it. Like, books, there's very few. These books were one of the rare chance you could buy a bound edition, unless you made one yourself, of older comics. And let me read from that. He's here talking about the creative impetus for the idea. As far as I knew, there had never been a major costume comic book character who was a wealthy and successful businessman. Now, I have to take issue right away with that. I'm sure Shane will have to wonder, Batman? Yeah. I mean, I don't know about that, Stan. But anyway, moving on. I could envision a Howard Hughes type with almost unlimited wealth, envied by other males and sought after by glamorous females. Like virtually all the mixed-up Marvel heroes, he'd have to be flawed. He'd be a playboy, a tycoon, a man's man, but he'd have some secret sorrow, some secret life and death problem that would plague and torment him each day of his life. So, and I've read other quotes from Lee where he talked about where he felt like he wanted to have fun with his audience and make a superhero he felt people would find antipathetic, someone who was a weapons manufacturer, someone who represented the establishment, someone who was not necessarily a completely sympathetic character in terms of the sort of the tropes he was applying to this figure, and it worked. And again, the Marvel Achilles heel, he created a character who, despite all these glamorous attributes beneath that facade, was tormented, and in many, both physically and mentally, had a lot of burdens to carry. And again, that's, I think, part of the secret of just the Marvel characters in general, but especially so with Tony Stark as he's developed throughout the ages. Now, we should also remind people that Iron Man did not have his own book initially. Very few of the Marvel characters did. We'll recall that because of a bad business decision in the 1950s, Martin Goodman had lost his distributor, and he was caught flat-footed with no way to distribute his comics, and he had to go hat in hand to his rivals at DC Comics, who controlled the distributor Independent News, which is DC's in-house distribution arm. And he basically asked them, will you distribute my books? And they said, sure, you can publish 8 titles a month. So can you imagine just how chagrined and humiliated he must have felt to have to do that? I can only imagine. But
That would have been some kind of meeting to be sitting in on.
so that's why we have the house books. You mentioned Journey into Mystery, Tales to Astonish, which had Ant-Man in it initially, Tales to Suspense, Strange Tales, right? Because that way they could put 2 characters in a book, and you could introduce more superheroes. And of course, all these books in the Atlas era were primarily showcases for monsters, weird sci-fi creatures, sort of eerie, Steve Ditko, O. Henry type stories, Twilight Zone feel, and so forth. And then, of course, we've talked about this many times. We go from the Fantastic Four, and then a whole new world starts to open up for Lee and his artistic co-creators, and the Marvel Universe is a-borning. And by the time we get in 1963, you've already got the FF, you've already got the Incredible Hulk. I think you have Thor already. Murd?
I'm pretty sure.
I think he's 62.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Spider-Man was first introduced at the tail end
August
of
of 62, I think.
1962 in Amazing Fantasy 15. So they're on to something. So Lee then moves on to this new creation. He gives the plot to his younger brother. Kirby's tasked, as it often was, with the initial concept of the character's look, the character design, and then Don Heck renders the character in the story. Now, we should remind people that Tales of Suspense 39 takes place in Vietnam. Let's give a little bit of historical context here. So it's 1963. The United States, when we think of the Vietnam War, our part in the Vietnam War, that doesn't really get going heavily until 1964 or 1965 under Lyndon Johnson. So we're not at that point yet when this story is rendered. And we should remind people that Vietnam has a very tortured history when it comes to fighting outside powers trying to influence the Vietnamese people, economically, politically, imperialism, and so forth. So our time in Vietnam is part of a much larger series of conflicts dating back centuries to China, and then France, then Japan, then France again, and then the United States. Now, I'm not going to get into all the politics of the Vietnam War. That's another show and another topic. But suffice it to say, when you read this story, it's very much the early Cold War, the commies! The commies are the villains, and, the United States is the superheroic bringer of democracy and capitalism to the poor, benighted third world. And Tony Stark is a symbol of that can-do American spirit that will elevate third world nations and drive out the sinister, pernicious influence of, red communism. And what do you guys think of the story when you think back to it? What's your reaction to that origin of Iron Man?
I just don't remember all that much about it. I'm sorry. It's been a while.
Hans, no need to apologize.
That's why my mic was down. You called on me. I wasn't ready for it.
Bird?
Honestly, the historical political aspects of it didn't impact me that strongly. Maybe just because, well, as you've said, it wasn't actually set during the time frame of the United States'
Heavy involvement. Yeah.
Yes, in that country. I mean, they were already proliferating troops at that time. I think at Kennedy's behest, in fact.
They were called advisors, which is a euphemism for U.S. soldiers training and leading the South Vietnamese forces in the field. So we were involved, just not with full-on combat troops, as we would be later. But we were there, so.
Yeah, so to me, yeah, the setting, I mean, it's certainly indicative of the time period, and we have the unfortunate sort of Asian warlord stereotype that was Wong Chu,
Oh, yes.
red guerrilla warlord, as I think he was called that word for word, in fact. I think you have it in your notes. But anyway, but beyond that, what struck me more than the setting, the time and place of his origin, was just the fact that what we're seeing here is kind of literally a change of heart for this character, because he's kind of arrogant at first. He's on the top of the world. He's this big shot munitions manufacturer. He goes to this obscure jungle to test new transistorized weapons, and he's literally hoist with his own petard. Something goes wrong. One of his own devices blows up on him, and he ends up getting a piece of shrapnel stuck in his heart. And he's captured by enemy troops, I guess.
They're supposed to be North Vietnamese communists. Yeah.
Right. What would eventually be the Viet Cong, I
Right.
guess. And so that's when he realizes he sees some of the error of his ways, I guess. He's inspired by the example of his fellow prisoner, Ho Yin Sen. And then, well, as I said, literal change of heart, because his heart has been damaged and he's kind of looking at what he's doing for a living in a different way. And so it's sort of his personal journey of transformation. It's like it's almost Shakespearean, really, and it's and I'm sure Stan Lee would invite that comparison himself. Just the way it sort of makes me think of Prospero, the sorceress Duke of Milan, who goes to this in this sort of self-imposed exile to this island off in the Caribbean, and comes to realize the error of his own ways, practicing his magic for kind of the wrong reasons, and then he kind of becomes more human as a result, and then that's kind of the thing that's happening to Tony Stark here, as he's physically becoming less human thanks to his incapacitation and his reliance on his armor to keep himself alive. He becomes more human in another respect. And so the Vietnam setting, geopolitical implications aside, it's just kind of like a fantastical, otherworldly setting for this transformation that takes place in him.
Well, two things. First of all, thank you for the majestic elevation of our discussion by bringing in Shakespeare and Prospero.
It's the very least I can do.
And second, I think you made a great point about the context, in the sense that the idea behind the character, which you just described so artfully, works in any background. So when you think about it, they've taken him from Vietnam to Afghanistan / the Middle East.
Yeah.
The background is as important as what happens to the character and then the journey he goes on through this transformation, essentially. I think that speaks to the strength of the kernel of the idea, essentially. I wanted to read from the issue, Tony Stark before the tragedy. Anthony Stark, rich, handsome, known as a glamorous playboy, constantly the company of beautiful, adoring women. Look, there's Tony Stark. This is a scene on the Riviera. He's the dreamiest thing this side of Rock Hudson. Fantastic.
That's a little dated.
That is a little
Just a bit.
The Riviera was a real drag till you showed up, darling. Yes, Anthony Stark is both a sophisticate and a scientist, a millionaire bachelor, as much at home in laboratories and high society. But this man who seems so fortunate, who's envied by millions, is soon destined to become the most tragic figure on earth. Now, one thing I want to point out, I find just the history so fascinating, how a comic or any kind of media captures a time period. If you look at the skin color of the Viet Cong.
Oh, wow. Wow.
So, and as someone who was married to an Asian woman who has Asian stepchildren, no one ever looks this yellow. And,
The color of warm butter.
yeah, but when you think back to like Charlie Chan or old Fu Manchu, the racial stereotypes of the time, the yellow peril was the term you would hear about communist China, for example, or even fascist Japan. And that carries over into these early Marvel Silver Age comics.
Yeah, we'll get more of that when we talk about the Mandarin, of course.
Oh God, yeah, and I'm not even saying this to criticize. It's just this is the time period. This is the reality we're dealing with when it comes to sort of popular culture's sense of the world, essentially. And let me read another quote from that I found very interesting. I'd forgotten this until I just read it again just yesterday. He's talking about the Vietnam context. Now, it's important that you bear in mind that this yarn was written in 1963, at a time when most of us generally felt that the conflict in that tortured land really was a simple matter of good versus evil, and the American military action against the Viet Cong was a tantamount to St. George's battle against the dragon. Which one was the dragon? Since that time, of course, we've all grown up a bit. We've realized that life isn't quite so simple. We've been trying to extricate ourselves from the tragic entanglement of Indochina. And he wrote this. The Vietnam War had not ended yet. This book came out in 1975, I believe. And yes, so let's say he wrote it in 74. And the Vietnam War officially ended. Well, we pulled most of our troops out in 73, but the conflict didn't end until 1975. So it's still probably in the news virtually every day when he's writing about this. And it's interesting to note that as you read Marvel comics, sorry, ladies and gentlemen, you know, I'm always a blundering buffoon. As you read Marvel comics, as they get into the later 60s, there's stories where they have protesters. You know, they talk about the Vietnam War, like Flash Thompson's drafted, and Peter Parker, you know, is cogitating, you know, I don't know how I feel about going to a war against an enemy I don't even hate. And, you know, that's a rough paraphrase of an issue where he's thinking that in a thought balloon. And so Lee is again, tapping into that zeitgeist. And as the popular culture is changing, we have to remember how divisive that war was in our society in the latter 60s and early 1970s, and how it really compelled many people to question, what is the United States? What is our place in the world? You know, what should we be doing with the awesome power that is at our command? Are we being told the truth about what we're doing in the world? Is this right? And in this early stage in 63, not many people are asking those questions. And again, not to get into a diatribe on Vietnam, but Vietnam was a very complicated conflict that was rooted in centuries of Vietnamese history. And it's interesting to see how it's portrayed in this early issue. It's a time capsule of how America's saw itself in terms of its conflict with the Soviet Union and communism and communist movements around the world. It's just fascinating to me. Now, we all know the story. I'm sure many of our listeners do as well. All right, so Tony's he's in Vietnam to test some of his new weaponry. He is ambushed. He's badly wounded by a booby trap, and there's a shrapnel from that explosion is moving towards his heart. He has days or weeks to live. And the sinister communist warlord Wang Chu demands that he make him a wonder weapon. And he meets a fellow hostage, Professor Ho Yinsen, who Stark had studied in college. And they work together to create a life-saving suit of armor that will keep his heart beating. Essentially, the technology prevents the shrapnel from entering his heart. Of course, we mentioned the tragedy of it is he can never remove the chest plate. If he does, the shrapnel will move to his heart and he will die. And furthermore, the chest plate has to be charged virtually every day. And that gets into some really fun, Pants is already laughing because he knows where I'm going, so fun plot points we'll touch upon in the near future. Let me read a quote from Don Heck. Now, Don Heck, as I mentioned, was a mainstay in terms of comic illustration. He'd already had a storied career, just a magnificent draftsman when it came to just the human body, especially drawing female characters. And he could do anything, westerns, war, superheroes, he did it all. He's often overlooked, which I think is a crying shame. Deeply talented artist, and he's one of the founding fathers of the Marvel Universe. Iron Man is what he's most famous for, but he drew the Avengers for a lengthy period of time. He drew a lot of other characters. I mean, he died in the 1990s from lung cancer. And when I was reading about him, one of the sad elements of his story was that it sounded like he was often put under pressure to draw in a style that was not his style. And, you know, it's common knowledge that Lee encouraged all the Marvel artists study Kirby. You don't have to copy Kirby, but the approach, the dynamic action shots, the panel layouts, that's the Marvel style. That's what I want to see in this art. And, you know, I was reading interviews with, like, John Romita Sr. where he said, like, Don would come, like, you know, Johnny, like, help me. Like, how do I do this? And show me, you know, what Stan's looking for and so forth and so on.
I'd heard that he'd had a little bit of trouble adapting himself to the kind of action that was expected from
that's what I was reading in the wonderful Coates book from Tomorrow's. But he stayed with it. I mean, he went over to D.C., he did work for them. But in the latter part of his career, it sounds like it was harder for him to get work. And when you think about that, I mean, this guy, for me, this guy's an icon. I mean, he's the co-creator of Black Widow, of Hawkeye, okay, among others. I mean, he drew so many important characters that laid the foundation for the Marvel Universe. And I have a personal, well, not personal, but my friend John Paul, who runs the wonderful NewJerseyComicBookShows.com, which he was doing for 20 years, early on in his career as a show promoter, he had Don Heck as a guest. And he said, the nicest guy, and he was doing sketches, John tells me, and basically giving them away. And John said, Don, charge more money for these sketches. You're Don Heck. And John was telling me how he was so humble, like it's almost like he either, maybe out of humility, he wasn't even acknowledging, the significance of the work he had done, essentially. So for me, this spotlight is also a celebration of what a great artist Don Heck was. And we'll have to see visual examples of that as we go forward.
I only have one piece of artwork by Don Heck, and he actually inked it. It's a page from the 1986 Hawkman series. It's from issue 4, and I think actually no, I have 2 pages, consecutive pages, because it had the villain Kite Man in it.
Oh, right.
And it features a mention in the dialogue of Golden Eagle, so it just spoke to me. So that's the only, and it's gorgeous. It's just so fun. So I have some Don Heck inked pages from late in his career.
Pansy Poo, I'm envious.
And speaking of his artwork, and I have to mention,
I rely on this, sir.
Looking through the Heritage Auction Archives for some artwork from this era. Now, this blew me away. This was auctioned off on, looks like, December of 2002.
Okay.
This is the original art for the complete 13-page story of Tale of Suspense 42.
Wow.
Went for $4,600. 13 pages.
That's it?
What? Again, that's
my God.
2002.
Now, granted, that's 2002.
Right.
Because original art wasn't booming the way it is now.
It was getting closer, but so whoever has that now, wow. Whew. So that's
the whole story.
The whole 13-page Iron Man story. It's the earliest I could find of a complete story together.
Wow.
Have you found any examples of Heck art going recently, like at higher prices?
Oh, geez, did I ever? Let's see.
Count on them.
Well, this was from
Look how sexy he gets. He talks about original art.
There's very few things that give me diarrhea of the mouth. One of them is talking about original comic book art.
Love
I would have said passion, but whatever.
I'm sorry. Okay, poor choice of words. So February of this year, 2016, page 4 of Tale of Suspense 43 was auctioned off. Just that one page sold for almost as much as a whole 13-page story, $4,400. I can't find it, but I've seen the first Black Widow appearance in issue 52 was auctioned off recently. So yeah, there's some stuff out there. Again, it's above my price range, but I love looking at the original black and white pencil work and ink.
Pansy, I was counting on that.
And you got it.
Outstanding, sir. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Read a couple quotes from Don Heck. This I found fascinating. He's talking about the creative process, the Marvel method. As we all know, and in case some listeners aren't familiar with, because Lee was wearing so many hats, he couldn't possibly write out full scripts for all these stories. There was no time. So the artists he had were so accomplished, and this is how they did it this way throughout the Silver Age. He would say, okay, Gene Colan or John Buscema, this month's story, the Avengers fight Kang. Go. And maybe a little bit more than that, but not much more. He was just a couple lines. If they met him in person, Lee was famous for hopping on desks and this is how I want the Vulture to look and that type of thing. And then the artist would go out, they'd draw the entire thing and bring it back to Lee, and then he'd fill in the captions and the word balloons, as we all know. That leads to some of the controversies now when it comes to creator credit, especially when it comes to Kirby. Now listen to Heck. We always wrote everything in the side, meaning the panels, on the original art. The whole story would be there. If you were thinking of something, you'd write in what you thought about as dialogue so that he, meaning Stan, would know what you were thinking. So you always hear about Kirby, and you've seen original art where Kirby's written detailed notes on what's happening, what they're doing, what he's saying, and so forth. And it's interesting that I'm going to make an educated guess and say they all did that to some degree.
Which is why I love looking at original comic book art. You get so much information, so much history in those
Absolutely.
pieces.
And again, when we talk about creator credit, and as everybody knows, I love Stan Lee. I'm never one to bash Stan Lee, but to be even-handed, he does not solely create any of these characters, basically. Okay, where a lot of the original ideas, perhaps germinating in his mind, sounds like it. But when it comes to the visuals, the costumes, the supporting characters, a lot of the actual plot developments, these artists were heavily involved. We have the pages. We see them, what's being written in the margins. Heck is saying it here as well. And when people think about creator controversy, they always think of Jack Kirby and Stan Lee. In fact, a little quick side note. I don't know if you've heard this, but you'd be interested in this especially. You all would. It might have been Mr. Wethington who mentioned it on one of the forums. I didn't realize that the great Michael Chabon had written a story for The New Yorker back in 2012 called Citizen Conn, C-O-N-N, which is an imagining of two famous comic creators who are old men, I think the name Mort Feather and Art Kahn, who have a falling out over these types of issues. Then he returns to them when they're really old and near the end of their lives. It's clearly based on Stan Lee and Jack Kirby. I started reading the story. It's on the New Yorker website. It's a phenomenal. So check that out. I haven't finished the story yet. When I do, I'll talk about it more on the air. It's 4 years ago. I'm late to the party, but fascinating. Because Chabon is such a huge fan of, as we all know, of comics and comic history. In fact,
Cavalier and Clay, I believe.
Have you read that?
Oh yeah,
it's a
I
masterpiece.
actually read that book. It was a book. I actually read it.
He read a book.
Don't sound so surprised.
I knew you could do it. Come on.
Yay for Brian.
Now, but actually, in that they interview Chabon about the story on the New Yorker, and he's name dropping like Don McGregor, Billy Graham, like the guy knows his stuff. So check that out on the New Yorker website. So another quote I have from Heck, he's talking about being involved in the creation of Iron Man and doing the early issues. It was fun to do, especially in the beginning. There were two characters, Happy Hogan and Pepper Potts. Stanley does mnemonic devices for his names. Love them. That I enjoyed doing. Tony Stark was the man about town type of thing. There was more characterization at the time, and I had more fun with it. And in the interview, I didn't copy it down, but I noted, at one point he was told, make Happy and Pepper prettier. Because if you go to the early issues, when he first renders them, Happy looks like a pugilist, like his nose is kind of broken. He's not really a good-looking guy.
Which
he's
he
a palooka.
He's an ex-fighter.
Yeah, and Pepper has a lot of freckles. And I read in the interview that Heck kind of based her in part on the actress who played Alice later on the Brady Bunch.
Oh, Ann B. Davis.
Yeah, and then apparently Lee said, okay, make them prettier, essentially, which I just found was fascinating. Because when you think about today in comics, some of the story art I admire most when someone draws, Ditko did this masterfully, like everyday people, and a lot of them are just kind of blah and ugly, which many people are, just average people. But there was the glamour that they were getting in here as well. So it's an interesting contrast. Now, as we all know, I'm going to talk a bit about sort of Tony's origin. Now, we should mention here that what we see in Tales of Suspense 39 is just the beginnings of it. A lot of Tony's origin has been retconned since that time, and I can see Murd shaking his head. There's some things that Marvel's done since then. Some of it I find almost bizarre when it comes to his character. Go ahead, Pants.
Well, it's because you almost have to with the updating because it happened during the Vietnam era, and it's been around for 50-some years. Keep him relevant.
And that I completely understand. I'm referring more to the character himself.
Oh, okay, yes.
So, but you're absolutely correct about that. So, what we see in Tales of Suspense 39, they really stick with that for a long time, like that basic premise of the character. As you get further into the latter Bronze Age and beyond, that's when they bring in the alcoholism. That's when they bring in, the troubled relationship with his father. The way he deals with women, all right? A lot of the seeds of that, they're in these early stories, but a lot of it's more subtle. It's more kind of, you can kind of see it behind, innuendo behind the scenes, underneath the surface. Like you see Tony like smoking cigarettes, and everybody smoked in the Silver Age.
Yeah.
Jamie did always talk about lovingly how Steve Rogers always had a pipe, right? When he was not acting as Captain America. So they show Tony with a cigarette. They show Tony, with cocktails and so forth. But that was the time, right? Now, Heck also mentions that when he thought about the design for Tony Stark, because he visualized Stark. He came up with the idea of, because Kirby didn't draw Tony Stark on the cover. That's all Heck. He thought of Errol Flynn, basically, the legendary actor from the 30s and 40s, like Robin Hood, for example. And, you know, Lee said, I want a Howard Hughes type character. And have you guys seen The Aviator?
I have not.
Yes. Yeah.
Tremendous film. But
Yeah.
you can see how, if you watch that movie or if you read about Howard Hughes, you can see how they drew Tony Stark from
sure.
that. You know, the daredevil pilot, the inventor, the visionary, the futurist, essentially. In fact, how does The Aviator end with DiCaprio looking in the mirror going, the future,
Yeah.
the future, right? That's a great film. But so all those ingredients are there. And you know, all credit to Lee and these artists for, again, when you have a great creative idea, and as you mentioned, Pants, you can change, there's different iterations, you can change the context. If the idea is strong, it still works. And I think that's very much the case with Iron Man and Tony Stark. Now, when we look at his origin, his parents, of course, are Howard Stark and Maria Stark. Now, we all know they are killed in an automobile accident. Now, in the comic, it's not by the Winter Soldier. All right, that's all the Marvel Cinematic Universe. That's a whole separate entity. It's a whole separate ball of wax. And this is a major retcon that's been done recently, where today they say in Marvel history that Tony was adopted. He's not the natural child of Tony and, of Howard and Maria. That's a very recent retcon.
That's weird.
Has his actual parentage been revealed yet in the comics?
I don't think so. The International Iron Man book, which is out now, is dealing with that. But honestly, I'm behind on that, so I can't answer that definitively. Someone on the forums can maybe help us out with that. But he was adopted in Bulgaria, and he's a child prodigy. All right, he goes to MIT at the age of 15. He, studies physics and electrical engineering. His father, of course, was also a brilliant industrialist, and they go into that heavily in the films as well. And they retcon that Tony and his father did not have a close relationship. Apparently, his father was a drinker as well, and it seems like he was closer to his mother. They established that during his collegiate career, he does cross paths with Bruce Banner, and then one of the great geniuses of the Marvel Universe, of course, later becomes the Hulk. And they touch upon it a little bit in these early stories. As a young man, Tony is excruciatingly arrogant. He is completely self-absorbed, self-indulgent and materialistic to a gratuitous degree. He's a total playboy, all right? Women are just playthings, essentially. And that's how he's living his life. And his parents are killed in the car crash. At the age of 21, he inherits Stark Industries, which is one of the leading weapons manufacturers, as Murd mentioned, in the Marvel Universe. Now, I forgot, was Stark Industries on Long Island? I feel like it was, the original plant.
Honestly don't know.
Someone can help us out on the forums. I think that's the case. Now, when Tony takes over his father's munitions business, he's just a genius at inventing weaponry. And as we see in this first issue, and Lee, and they must have seen this as so high tech for the time. It's so quaint today. Transistors, right? So, he can use transistors and miniaturization to create this whole new arsenal of weaponry and weapons technology for the U.S. to fight the commies, all right, in the Cold War. Now, what I find fascinating about Tony Stark in this era is when you think about the Cold War, and Murd mentioned this, like the James Bond element of the character, right? He's so the glamour of Tony Stark, the intrigue, the industrial espionage, all of that. And that's when we think about some of the dynamic sort of adventurism of the Cold War. That's the kind of thing you think about, that world of spies and intrigue and high-stakes diplomacy and so forth. And you totally see Tony Stark very much in that niche, in that world. But for me, there's also, he also kind of represents the dark undercurrent of that era. In the United States and the Soviet Union were locked in, we weren't alive for much of this. We were alive at the tail end of it. We're locked in a rivalry that potentially could have wiped out virtually all human life on the planet. And in the Cuban Missile Crisis, that nearly happened. So Lee's probably thinking of that too, and as the Stark character progresses, eventually, as we know, but although much further down the road, he will renounce making weapons. They do that very quickly in the film, because they have to, but it's a much longer progression in the comic. But in these early stories, he is a cold warrior. Like, he's all about making these weapons, making this technology, giving America that cutting edge. And we'll see stories in our checklist, some of which are almost comical, where he's taking on these Soviet agents and these saboteurs and things of that nature. So that's what I find very interesting about the character of Tony Stark. The glamour, but also that dark undercurrent of how dangerous the Cold War was and how much it was perpetuated by, as Eisenhower put it, the military-industrial complex, which Tony Stark was very much an intrinsic part of in terms of the Marvel Universe. Merge, you want to say something?
Practically a personification of it.
Well put, my friend. Well put. Any comments before we move on, my friends? I don't want to monopolize.
Oh, hey, you go right
You're
ahead.
doing a soliloquy
Yeah.
there. Just
You're
keep it
on a
going,
roll.
brother.
Roll on.
Do you take a breath at all when you're doing this?
Only
You
now,
didn't,
Magpie.
you didn't see the
only
gills in the back of his neck?
Now, we should also mention, again, this is retconning, but a very important character. Marvel retcons that when Tony escapes Wong Chu's lair, and Wong Chu and his men are wiped out, and we'll talk more about the armor a little bit later. He encounters a downed U.S. pilot, James Rhodey Rhodes, who is fighting in Vietnam. He's a U.S. Air Force pilot, and they make their way back to South Vietnamese U.S. lines together, and that, of course, begins their lifelong friendship, which I thought was really captured well in the movies.
Yeah.
Especially by,
Don Cheadle? Is that
well, I
right?
love Don Cheadle, but I thought the other guy did an even better job.
Terrence Stamp.
Terrence Stamp.
No.
Like their,
Yeah, that's right.
their interplay in that first film, I thought really captured the Tony Rhodey dynamic really well. Now, we should also mention that Tony, and this is examples of how the Marvel Universe interlocks, Tony is not just Iron Man, he's also involved as one of the key architects of S.H.I.E.L.D. And we read the early Nick Fury stories. And by the way, ladies and gentlemen, I am working on a Nick Fury, Hydra, Advanced Idea Mechanics Spotlight.
Oh, stop it.
Yes.
Stop it.
That
You're
one's gonna
killing
take
us.
that one's going to take a while. Come on. We got to
That's going to take a while.
Yeah. We got to talk about Hydra. I mean, they're everywhere now. I
Terrence.
mean, Drunk Cap was just at a rally, right, with the Hydra flag. So come on.
Terrence Howard.
There you go.
Oh, Terrence Stamp is
Terrence Stamp.
Zod.
Zod.
Yeah.
Yeah.
People were like shouting to their iPods
yeah,
when we
they
said
are.
Terrence Stamp. Both fine actors.
Oh,
in different
absolutely.
ways. So, Tony is one of the key architects of S.H.I.E.L.D. He's involved in the manufacture of a lot of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s technology. In fact, when you read the early Nick Fury, Agent of S.H.I.E.L.D. stories and Strange Tales, Tony Stark is there, not as Iron Man, but as Tony Stark, helping set up S.H.I.E.L.D. And of course, he's one of the founding members of the Avengers. So even early on, Tony Stark is a major player in the Marvel Universe, both not only as Iron Man, but as the genius, billionaire inventor / industrialist. Now, as I mentioned, in the Silver Age, it's all about communism in the early stories. So Crimson Dynamo, Titanium Man,
Black Widow.
Black Widow is the best example. It's all about taking on the Soviets, right? Taking on the communist menace, the Red Tide, and defending, the traditions of capitalism and democracy and all that propaganda and so forth. Now, we should mention that his rogues gallery will eventually expand to probably what many people consider his arch nemesis, the Mandarin, right? Who is another character who's gone through a lot of permutations through the years, but again, as Murd mentions, very much early on versed in that yellow peril type of approach to an Asian villain. Now, any comments or questions at this time, gentlemen, on anything? Because I want to talk a bit about the personality of Tony Stark, just who the man is as he's been developed. And this, again, the seeds of these early stories, and they run with it, progressively to get through the various eras. Now, as I mentioned, before his moral awakening that Murd mentioned in that cave he was in or that military complex he was in with Professor Yinsen, this is a man who didn't really give a damn about anybody. This is someone who was very much engrossed in his pleasures, his work, his materialism. And as Murd mentioned so beautifully, when he has to save himself and make that armor, he's encasing himself in that armor. By sort of walling himself off, he's also kind of freeing his moral self as well, and becoming a man who's now thinking of not just myself, but how can my gifts help the world, essentially. And when you read all Iron Man comics, at the core of it is really that struggle. Like, he's struggling between his own desires and how can I apply my genius, not just for myself but to help other people, and so forth. And as you move forward with the character, the womanizing, the alcoholism, the pride, and that sense of, and you see this a lot of times with Tony's character, the ends justify the means. And in many stories with Iron Man, especially as you move forward with the character's history, he'll do things that are like, I don't know about that one, it's kind of sketchy. You understand why he's doing it, because he thinks that in the end justify the means, and what he's doing is good for everybody. But the means of getting there is rather sordid sometimes. You see that more in the more modern era. But again, great German idea by Lee, Kirby, and Heck and Lieber. The character's there right from the get-go, right? Those strengths and those foibles, essentially. So Tony is someone who can be self-loathing. He can be unstable. He can be very self-indulgent, even when he's best. And a lot of relationships he's lost or have struggled or fractured because of the kind of person he is. I have a quote from Reed Richards discussing Tony. He says, "A future man trapped in the now, a prisoner raging against the slow crawl of human evolution." Because Tony, from the get-go, is a futurist. And someone like that is thinking, 10 steps ahead about how can I apply my genius to improve the world, but the world isn't ready for what he's trying to do, essentially. We should also mention that Tony has no action. This is long before Extremis, so in these early stories, he has no superhuman powers. It's just his mind and his iron will, essentially. And of course, we should mention that Steve Rogers, as he did with so many characters, taught him hand-to-hand combat. So I wouldn't want to confront Tony Stark in a dark alley. He'd probably beat the crap out of someone because he was trained by the greatest hand-to-hand combatant in the Marvel Universe, essentially. Now, Tony, of course, is also, you see in the early stories, he's a brilliant engineer, inventor, a very skillful and shrewd businessman. He's Howard Hughes, right? He's this corporate titan, essentially. Again, as Murd mentioned, he's the embodiment of the military-industrial complex of the early Cold War. A great strategist and tactician. And they really emphasize this, I think, nicely in the third Iron Man film. At the core of his strength is his will. Not even the armor, it's the will that drives the armor. That's what is Iron Man, essentially. And let's talk about the armor. Wow, that could be an episode itself. Now, Shane, would you call up, I think I wrote Model 1 as the image. The computer's not quiet. Here we go.
Bingo.
Love my shoddy school computer. All right. Model 1 armor. Now, first let's give a sort of an overview of the armor, because a lot of the different versions of the armor kind of have some commonalities attached to them. We should also mention, that's one of the great things about writing a comic book. The writer can just make stuff up that serves the story and just put it in the armor, basically. So we talk about the Silver Age versions of Tony's armor. Let's first address, like an overview, some of the basic things the various armors can do. The wearer can lift usually up to 100 tons. In terms of flight from the jet boots, can reach speeds up to Mach 10. The jet boots can allow him to carry a load capacity of about 500 tons. And you see many stories where Iron Man's carrying things that a normal man could never possibly carry, for example. Big vehicles or rockets or whatever else. Of course, the armor is originally powered by electronic transistors, which would seem cutting edge in 1963. Later, of course, they'll have solar power will power it, and he can absorb energy and so forth. But in these early days, it's a transistorized suit of armor. The armor can absorb energy. It's impervious to bullets, explosions, the elements, the vacuum of space, acid. self-contained life support system. He can go underwater, right? And, this super protects him from the elements underwater as well. Radiological, chemical, biological agents. The armor is invulnerable to all of them. They even I was reading some notes where in later versions of the armor could withstand an atomic explosion, apparently. Only Tony Stark, of course, can generate magnetic and anti-magnetic fields. Now, of course, we all know what is the iconic primary weapon system of the armor.
Repulsor rays.
From the palms. All right, so a wide dispersal pattern or a focused beam, and of course the repulsor ray, and he can control, the intensity of it. It can, think about it in the Civil War movie. He knocks the Falcon down when after Rhodey's been hurt with a little burst, or it can level a mountain with it. Basically, I mean, they can be incredibly powerful. Of course, the armor has an onboard computer and targeting system when it comes to using his weapons. The chest plate, I think, is one of the most iconic aspects of the Iron Man armor.
Yeah.
And in its original version, it's basically just like a searchlight. That's kind of it's like a light beam. But of course, as time passes, when we talk about the uni beam, it can project energy and it becomes a weapon system in itself. And if I remember correctly, and I could be wrong about this, but I remember correctly, I think when he uses that, it tends to drain his armor significantly when he uses that uni beam. I could be wrong about that. See if that's in the back of my mind. Now, the other fun things about the armor is that, as I said, they need something for a story. All right, we'll give him lasers. We'll put a buzzsaw on his fingers.
We'll give him roller skates.
Roller skates, which, call it the roller skate image, please, Shane. It doesn't get better than that.
There it is.
Suction cups to stick to things, like a little flamethrower shoots out of the finger, tear gas.
It slices, it dices, it
yes.
makes julienne fries. Wait, there's more.
The Ginsu knife.
I just went back to watching TV as a kid in the 1980s. Thank you, Pants. Next, you're going to do Crazy Eddie. Now,
My prices are insane.
of course, things like image inducers. These all are Stark technology. They all pop on the various iterations of the armor. Now, Shane, if you could go back to the Model 1 image, please. So the Model 1 armor is, and I think they did a great job rendering that in the movie, too.
Oh,
Yeah,
my
yeah.
God, yeah, I
Yeah.
love that. Yeah.
Like that, I thought it was lovingly done, the way they handled
it's
that.
clunky the way I would expect it
Yeah,
to
it
be
was
clunky.
really well done. But it's a Kirby design.
Yeah.
And there's no rasp attached to it. It's just a gray metal suit. It doesn't have most of the bells and whistles of later armor because he's working with spare parts, essentially, that are given to him by his Viet Cong captors. So, and its primary function is to keep him alive. And what we often forget about when we think about old Iron Man comics, you don't see this in the new ones, he had to wear that chest plate every day. Like, he couldn't take it off. So he'll redesign it so it's lighter and more flexible so he can wear it underneath his clothing. But when you think about, like, Tony Stark, the womanizer, that's over.
Yeah. Doesn't that his first appearance make it sound near the end like he'd have to wear the full armor all the time?
I think you're right about that.
Yeah,
Mert.
they kind of pushed that idea aside pretty quickly.
No, I
but
think you're right about that. In fact, let's take a look.
made it sound like he was going to be another sort of monstrous
Almost
figure.
like a Frankenstein's monster, like trapped in this form.
Or a Ben Grimm, this man, this monster. This, as you
Right
were just
here.
saying, the Playboy ladies man suddenly has this, a couple tons of metal between himself and any lady he might be interested in.
Murd clutches always. I'll read from the comic. He's thinking to himself, because he just put on the armor. They're coming, meaning the Viet Cong. This is my greatest test. Can the thing I have created survive? The thing which is less than human, yet far more than merely human. This thing which is now Anthony Stark. My brain still thinks, my heart still beats, but in order to remain alive, I must spend the rest of my life in this iron prison. So, but they probably realized that's going to be tough, so we're going to, we're going to downgrade that a little bit, just have the chest plate.
Miniaturize.
Yes, but
The wave of the future.
even there, think about the life he lived. It's over. So he'll maintain that facade like, the man about town, but in reality, how can he explain to a woman, well, excuse me, honey, I got to go plug my cord into the socket to recharge my
Baby,
heart.
roll
basically.
over.
Not a
Yeah.
euphemism.
Kinky.
Yeah.
So, Merc is kinky. Fantastic. So, the original armor, it has some, some crude weaponry in it. He can he can't fly, but he can kind of leap up. But then they showed the original movie. He couldn't really fly, just kind of leaped up and then went down, essentially. Some primitive weaponry, but it's basically A, so he can escape, and B, he won't die. That I think in the movie they say it's a magnet. I forgot in the comic if they just say it's the transistor, the electricity keeps the strap from going into his heart, essentially. Now, Shane, if you could go to Model 2, please. And I'm skipping over something. We should mention Model 1 Mark II is when they make the clunky armor gold. And they kind of give it like a metal skirt.
Yeah, that was Avengers 1, I think. Was that when we first saw it, or?
No, it was first seen in, actually, Tales of Suspense 40.
Okay, just that
because
quickly. Okay.
In the next issue, his girlfriend of the time, Marion, who was just a throwaway character for the issue, basically says, the armor just seems threatening. And because Iron Man saves, there's runaway lions in a circus, and he restrains them, and she comments on it, so then he paints the armor gold, essentially. So you're right, in Avengers 1, that's the armor he's wearing, the gold armor. It's Model 1 Mark II. Let's go on to Model 2, which Shane just put on the screen. Now, this is where we begin the classic red and gold design. And it's designed by Steve Ditko.
Yeah.
Now, when we think of Steve Ditko, you think of Spider-Man, you think of Doctor Strange, but Lee used whoever was on hand when he needed an artist.
Sure.
And it's Ditko. And he deserves the credit because he designed the original red and gold armor. Now,
and you know what? I'm not sure if I actually knew that until you just mentioned that here. I mean, it might have, but I don't think I remembered that. Once again, you've enlightened me, teacher.
Pantaloons, I live to serve.
Okay.
Now, so this armor, besides looking really snazzy, it's functional in that he says, all right, I got to have a lighter armor. The old armor, Model 1, he had to put on every piece. He couldn't, except for the chest plate, he couldn't wear it underneath his clothes, so it took him a minute or two to put everything on. Now he has armor that's more flexible, that's lighter, that doesn't use up as much energy, because remember, the chest plate keeps his heart beating. So it drains faster. I got to find a wall socket to plug myself in. So, in fact, Shane, could you call up the wall socket image, please? Because it's classic. Again, the Achilles heel, right? So every Marvel character has to have that weakness. There have been many stories where Tony has to flee from battle or end a battle quickly because he's going to drop because his heart's going to seize up on him. And he's got to find that wall. There's a classic story. It's a Tales of Suspense 97 in Son of Origins.
With Whiplash, right?
Where Tony is immobilized and he's in the back of a car in the armor and he goes, oh, thank God there's a cigarette lighter. And he plugs himself into the cigarette lighter, which gives him just enough power to start moving again inside the armor. Now, the red and gold armor, Model 2, so it's like a malleable metallic mesh. So what that means is he only has to put on certain parts of it, and the rest kind of springs up from the cuffs and so forth and covers the rest of his body. So it comes on a lot, because again, he's a genius. Well, you wouldn't say artificial intelligence, we're nowhere near that yet, but it's a more malleable form of metal that can spring up and then cover his body. So he doesn't have to put everything on, like with the original armor. Now, another famous image of those pods on his waist, on the sides of the armor, which contained extra energy storage. The armor also contains, from what I read, a spare extension cord. So when he's got to plug in,
Yeah, gotta have a plug.
he's got to have it, otherwise he's going to die. Now, what I always found interesting about this armor was the horns. So the helmet Ditko designed, you see it there in the image, has these horns. What do you guys think of that helmet?
I love that look.
I liked it too.
I love it.
I think it's cool.
Yeah,
as
yeah,
hell.
yeah.
It's retro cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Now, a later version of Model 2, they got rid of the horns, and then they put rivets, which you see over on the top of the helmet, essentially. So I think it's fair to say, and please let me know if you disagree, that when you think of Iron Man armor, especially if you're a comic book reader, you think of the red and gold
Oh, yeah.
armor,
Yes.
especially Model 3, which we'll look at. Go to Model 3 if you would, Shane. To me, this is the definitive Iron Man armor.
That is.
Yeah.
Model 3. Now, when we think about
I'm old.
the term good old shell head, right? It's this armor. This is the smooth. They've removed the horn. They've removed the rivets. It's just a smooth Iron Man faceplate. You've got the classic look in terms of the armor. Now, a Model 3, based on what I read, is where they first incorporate the repulsor rays into the armor. I mean, many writers created all different gadgets, well, primarily Lean Lieber, I should say, when needed in these stories. But when we think about Iron Man's armor, the red and gold, it's this era. Now, we should point out that we mentioned before the famous nose plate. That's not till the Bronze Age, which will be another episode. But it's actually, I think, the Model 4 armor that is introduced in the Bronze Age, which is basically this armor just with more bells and whistles attached to it. That is like the definitive, longest-running Iron Man armor that goes into the 1980s, essentially. But for me, Model 3 for me is iconic. Like when I think of Iron Man,
Yep.
I mean, naturally, people who just saw the movies, they're going to think of like the Adi Granov design Iron Man armor, which you see in the films.
Sure.
But for an old-timer like me, it's this.
Yeah.
What do you guys think?
Yeah,
I would
I'm
agree with
you,
that.
yeah.
That's the first thing I remember seeing, that kind of armor.
Me too. Yeah. The multimedia I saw when I was a kid, the cartoon,
Yeah.
and lunch boxes, my underoos, etc. You know,
Underoos or underwear?
this is it.
It's fun to wear.
Now, we should mention Model 2, the disc design premiered in Tales of Suspense 48, and the Model 3 appeared in Tales of Suspense 66. So again, a lot of the key Iron Man history, it's all in Tales of Suspense. He doesn't get his own book until 1968. Let's talk about it at the end of our episode. By the way, I should mention, as we move towards our checklist, I thought for this episode, since so much of Iron Man Silver Age history is in Tales of Suspense, that's really what we're going to focus on here. And we'll end the episode with the beginning of Iron Man issue 1 in 1968. So we're ending right before the end of the Silver Age, but I didn't want to jump into the main Iron Man title because that goes very quickly into the Bronze Age, essentially. So we're gonna end the episode with Iron Man 1, that iconic Gene Colan cover.
And it looks, from my limited observations here, that Tales of Suspense was a monthly comic book.
Yes.
As opposed to like twice a month. I mean, 6 times a year or 8 times a year. Some books of the era, this was actually.
Well, Marvel had to do that because of the DC had that severe limit, that draconian limitation of 8 titles a month.
But yeah, in Tales of Suspense, there were other stories. So it was mostly, I think, like 13-page stories for Iron Man at this point. So.
And I'm glad you brought that up, Pam, because we have to remember, Marvel's still doing a lot of these fun, bizarre backup stories that do not have Marvel Universe characters in them as we know them.
Which I still, I'm not even sure what some of those backups are, because I've only seen the stories, like in the Marvel Masterworks, of Iron Man or of Cap or whatever.
And as time progressed, as the Marvel Universe became more popular and successful, they phased out those backup stories and they put in other Marvel characters. So eventually, Tales of Suspense featured Captain America as the second feature. Strange Tales with Nick Fury and Doctor Strange.
Yes.
Tales to Astonish originally was Ant-Man, and then it was the Hulk and the Submariner.
Right.
Strange Tales also featured the Human Torch. Not the most memorable stories, I think you'd agree with that, Murd. But so
He introduced a few interesting characters.
That's true, including the prototype early return of Captain America, if I remember correctly, in Strange Tales.
Right.
The Acrobat.
Right, exactly. A villain called the Acrobat who impersonated Cap.
Right. So these house books are so important when you study the Marvel Silver Age history. Now, any comments before we plunge into the checklist, gentlemen?
No, just looking forward to this, because this is where I really want to learn all these things, because like I said, I haven't reread most of these issues in years, and some of them haven't seen at all. And I just love the short 13-page stories that were part of a bigger issue, and that's why I'm here to learn.
Murray, any comments on the armor or anything?
Oh, no, not at this time.
Is there a version of Iron Man's armor that you prefer? That's a favorite of yours?
To me, the definitive Iron Man armor is whatever he was wearing in the early 90s, when those trading cards were
Which was red and gold, but
it was
still
more
sophisticated.
It wasn't too different from the, what was it, Model 2 or Model 3 that Shane put on the screen a few minutes ago.
I love how we all always go back to the time period that we started reading comics and how it's just natural. It's fascinating to me how it shapes.
It's just when we imprint, as it were.
Yep. Murd, I could hear about your Marvel trading cards experience all day. Fantastic. All right, the checklist. Now, as we mentioned, Tales of Suspense 40 is, they say, all right, we're chucking the gray color, it's going to gold. So Iron Man now, it's the same Model 1 armor, but now it is of gold color. We should mention that throughout the stories, Tony is always adding new gadgetry to his armor. They always emphasize that he's a brilliant inventor, he's always come with new ways. And that's a theme when you think about it throughout the entire history of the character. Any writer dealing with Iron Man, they're always showing Tony Stark's inventive genius when it comes to the Iron Man armor.
Now, I must interrupt here if I may.
Please.
Tales of Suspense 40, according to Comic Book DB, lists as the writer for this issue 40 story, Robert Bernstein,
Yes.
R. Burns.
Yes.
Have we mentioned him at all before?
I've seen his name on occasion in early Silver Age stuff.
I think he came up during the Thor spotlight,
He did.
too.
You're right,
Okay.
Nerd. I think did you have some information about him, or am I imagining that?
You may be imagining it, but if I
Okay.
did, I've since forgotten it.
Fair enough. I'm sure we can get some help on the forums. In the early days of the Marvel Silver Age, Lee did, because he was doing so much, he would sometimes pass off scripting to his brother, Larry Lieber.
You mentioned him, of course. Right.
This gentleman, R. Bernstein, then they bring in like Roy Thomas in '65. Denny O'Neil briefly worked at Marvel in the '60s, then of course Gary Friedrich. So gradually Lee was handing off scripting chores, but you know, again, Stan Lee, I mean, the guy was prodigious. I mean, he was scripting most of these titles well into the 1960s. You know, Spider-Man, Fantastic Four, Daredevil. You know, he did many issues of old. I mean, with FF he wrote over 100 issues. Spider-Man he wrote over 100 issues. So, that was a workhorse. Now, so issue 40, the gold armor appears. It's seen as not as threatening because they feel the gray armor's scary. That's what Marion, his girlfriend in the moment, says. And Tony subdues escaped circus cats.
He also battles Gargantus, the robot caveman.
Murd, I was counting on that. Anything you want to say about Gargantus?
He's
Not a long pedigree in Marvel history, but
No, not really. He was just kind of a one-off baddie. But he was invented by a race of aliens. I don't know why they decided to build a robot caveman. Maybe they thought humankind would find him threatening, and perhaps they built it a long time ago and didn't get a chance to put it into practice until, well, the modern day. So perhaps he was supposed to be, he was maybe based on what humanity was at the time he was built. I don't know. But he apparently was an alien superweapon that was lost on Earth for years, and then he woke up and was just kind of silly.
and is smited by Iron Man.
Yes, it's fairly easily, I think.
Murd, I thought of you for issue 41. We should mention again, the names of all these creators to any Marvelite, your heart should be beating faster, right? So Dick Ayers inks issue 41. And it's Dr. Carlos Strange is Iron Man's adversary. Now, Murd, please explain. This is not the Doctor Strange we're thinking of.
Right.
You could elaborate, please, my friend.
Not Dr. Stephen Strange, no relation. He's just a mad scientist who was in the process of being taken into custody by U.S. military when he was struck by lightning, which always gives people superpowers. As we know. Doesn't electrocute them, stop their hearts, give them severe burns or anything. It just gives them superpowers. In Dr. Carlos Strange's case, it gave him the ability to manipulate other people's neuroelectricity, thereby giving him the power to control their minds. And
Is this his only appearance?
I think so. Well, people like Kurt Busiek were always going back and plucking odd characters like this out of obscurity. And so, we can't safely say that any of these characters made only one appearance. If nothing else, there were a series of handbooks that Marvel did, like Marvel in the 60s, Marvel in the 70s.
Yes, I remember them, yeah.
And they provided profiles of oddities that were very much in and of the period in which they were created and didn't appear very much afterwards. So it seems like characters like Gargantus and Dr. Carlos Strange would have been ideal for something like that.
Iron Man, The Iron Age by Kurt Busiek.
Kurt Busiek. See?
Oh,
What
Issue 1.
that's a great story. That was, I think, a 2-issue prestige format miniseries.
Exactly. Looking back at and sort of revisiting
Yes.
and...
Pants. Oh, clutch. No, actually, that's not in trade paperback, but you can probably find it in some bargain bins.
I would think.
If you want to get a real sort of retro feel for Tony Stark's Silver Age, which Kurt Busiek understands so well, read that story. It's really well done. Is Bob Layton the artist in that? Pants? Is it? I forgot who drew it.
Patrick Zurcher.
Zurcher.
Okay.
Right.
And the art is wonderful. Magnificent, sir.
And one other thing I should mention, throughout all these Tales of Suspense stories, even though there are many stories in them, Iron Man is always the cover feature.
Yes, until Captain America becomes his coach,
Right.
and then they alternate.
Yes.
Right, that's correct, sir. Now, issue 42, Don Heck begins penciling versus the Red Barbarian.
Dun, dun, dun.
Those commies, those pinkos. So, come on.
Hold your breath. Here comes Iron Man. See what happens when a deadly foe of Iron Man learns of his real identity. I like these taglines out there as well.
Classic Lee hyperbole. So, it's the early 60s, and you saw it in the Hulk. Think about the Fantastic Four. We can't let the commies beat us into space, right? That's one of the go-to plot devices that Lee would always turn to, because that was the zeitgeist at that time. All right, think about the space race, for example, which clearly motivated the Fantastic Four origin. So he faces the Red Barbarian, another one-off, communist adversary. Issue 43, Murd, I was hoping you'd help me out here. Kirby and Heck handle the art. So Kirby's bouncing because he's doing so many things for Lee at this point. Kala, Queen of the Netherworld, who they say is the Queen of Atlantis. Does this ring a bell with you?
Well, yeah, it's...
the Submariners Atlantis?
well, it's pre-Cataclysm Atlantis.
Okay.
It's like antediluvian Atlantis. So she's queen of the city of Netheria, otherwise known as the Netherworld, which is this underground city of descendants of
The
survivors of the Great Atlantean Flood.
That was above the surface.
Right,
Okay.
right. So these are not Homo mermanus.
Right.
These are a more ancient, air-breathing strain of Atlanteans. But yeah, she's a queen of this underground city, and eventually this character would be brought back, and she would come into conflict with Tyrannus and the Mole Man, other underground
Tyrannus.
monarchs. And she actually became the consort of Mole Man a couple of times.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah,
Magnificent.
marriages of
creepy.
convenience.
Murd?
Was she blind too? I mean,
Well, more like when she came up to the surface and found that surface air rapidly aged her into an old woman, so she didn't have a lot of options, She had to settle.
oh, I love these
The
digressions
poor
so
Mole Man
much.
is not the most, fetchingly handsome man in the Marvel Universe. So.
That darn air.
Recently, he was trying to date Squirrel Girl, but she was having none of it.
Outstanding.
Good for her.
Now, issue 44, Don Heck is now installed as a regular penciler. There's a great moment in this story, which I had to mention, where Tony is watching belly dancers. And it reminded me of the scene in the classic James Bond film, From Russia with Love, where he's in Istanbul, and Bond is watching some gypsy belly dancers get into a cat fight. Do you guys remember the scene I'm talking about? I was wondering if... Had that movie come out by this time? I think it had. I wonder if they were inspired by that. But when he's watching the belly dancers, he falls ill because he needs to charge his chest plate. So that's a running plot thread, like to get Tony's in a perilous situation because his heart's going to seize up because he's running out of power. And they always find new ways how he has to try to excuse himself to charge up the plate.
Now, in all seriousness, does he have a gauge or does an alarm go off so he knows?
I don't recall. I seem to recall he starts to feel himself sort of draining away.
Gets 20%, the
Oh,
battle
yeah,
starts flashing, that kind of thing.
Yeah, like the chest plates are.
Now, in this story, he goes back in time to the era of Cleopatra.
He goes back in time.
Yes. And he
He
helps
plugs in and all of a sudden, zoom.
He helps Cleopatra first against the Romans, which totally shows that Stanley had no concept of ancient history because Cleopatra was actually a vassal of the Roman Republic. But anyway,
They didn't have the internet back then. Come on.
and
Just had Encyclopedia
he
Britannica.
They had libraries.
he protects Cleopatra against the mad
to the
pharaoh.
library.
Yeah, which is spelled Pharoah throughout the whole story. Kind of like the recent racehorse whose name was also misspelled.
That's
that
right,
way. It
Mark.
just drives me nuts.
And there's a scene where the Cleopatra is clearly taken with Iron Man. And she asks him to remain, to be like her champion, and he's like, God, she's even more beautiful than I imagined. Actually, if you read about Cleopatra historically, they don't think she was as stereotypically attractive as people think, but that she was so charismatic and cunning that she drew men like Caesar and Antony to her side, essentially. So
she knew how to use what she had.
exactly. Now, and in fact, in that story at the end, they find hieroglyphics from Cleopatra's time, and they see an Iron Man-like figure in the hieroglyphics.
Of course
essentially.
they do.
Issue 45. Shane, you could call it the. Actually, I miswrote it as poop, but the poor Pepper image. This is the first appearance of Happy Hogan and Pepper Potts. As we know, Stan Lee's legendarily bad memory, most of his characters would have alliterative names so you could remember them. Tony Stark being one of the few exceptions, actually. And Donald Blake is another exception. But, you know, Reed Richards, Sue Storm.
Peter Parker.
Peter Parker, right? So, during the story, issue 45, Tony's in an auto race.
I'm sorry, I'm reading the
we'll get to that in a minute,
page.
right?
Oh, my
so
God.
he's racing, because, you know, he's the flashy playboy, so he's in an auto race. His heart seizes up during the auto race, and Happy, who's an observer, helps him out and, you know, plugs his chest plate into a wall outlet so he can restore himself. And Tony is so moved by this, he hires Happy as his chauffeur, like his body man, like how the president has a body man, essentially. And Peppers, of course, is Tony's devoted secretary, who's totally in love with him. And they basically make a love triangle out of this because Tony is actually in love with Pepper. But he feels that because of his affliction, he can never really be hers. So he's going to maintain his like playboy facade. And Happy falls in love with Pepper too. And if you look at the panel Shane has up here, men. A girl spends all day at the beauty parlor getting a new hairdo and covering her freckles. But do you notice? No. I could look like an old dish rag for all you'd care. And there's the Palooka Happy. I kind of liked you the other way. Tony, Pepper in his ascot. For heaven's sake, I didn't even know it was you. You're beautiful.
See, now with the ascot, you almost have to do the whole Thurston Howell the Third. Pepper, for heaven's sake, I didn't even know it was you. You're beautiful.
And this must have been when Lee told Heck, make them better looking.
Yeah.
Think about how what a backhanded compliment Tony is giving Pepper here, essentially.
Yeah.
Again, if you look at the early Marvel stories, women are often done a disservice in terms of their characterization. They're often there to be the damsel in distress, to be the source of like a love triangle. Like think of Ben and Reed, for example. The unattainable pursuit for the male character. But in terms of being, like Danielle would be raging right now.
Oh, yeah.
Raging, all right, because this is so indicative of the early 60s. We're before like the real onslaught of the feminist movement. So when you think about the early female characters, they're there to serve a particular plot device. But in terms of being strong, vibrant characters on their own, we're not there yet.
Yeah.
Now, Pepper today is such a powerful character in terms of her personality, her business acumen. I mean, although right now they have Mary Jane Watson doing it, but for the most part, Pepper becomes like she runs Tony Stark's life for him, essentially. And I thought they captured that dynamic beautifully in the movies. Like, I really loved the way how Gwyneth Paltrow played Pepper Potts. So from the minute she...
Oh, yeah.
One of the best things about those films.
She knew everything that was going on.
Yeah.
And she ran everything
But for the
anyway.
minute she subtly insults the whorish reporter, which is sometimes I take out the trash.
I know.
I'm like, oh, it's Pepper Potts. Perfect. Like, they got it. Right on the money. And Happy, of course, Murd, what do you think of Happy Hogan, like as a character? What?
It's hard not to love him and sympathize with him. He's just such a sad sack, and the name Happy was an ironic nickname from the start. But
what is his actual given name? I don't
Harold.
know. It's Harold. Okay, I forgot.
Harold
what that was.
Happy Hogan.
All right, and he's a boxer, and he's completely loyal. I mean, that's his strongest, most endearing trait.
You keep calling him a Palooka, and that's exactly what he like Joe Palooka. He's sort of reminiscent of that character. Actually, he's just like a sympathetic, lovable old punch drunk with a heart of gold.
And as we're going to learn here, he's more perceptive than people may have actually realized, as we're going to see. Now, Murd, issue 46.
Hold on a sec.
Oh.
A couple more things about number 45.
Please.
I noticed on the front cover, they actually make a big deal about the introduction of Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan. Like, there's a large caption at the bottom that says, also in this great issue, introducing Pepper Potts and Happy Hogan, destined to become two of your favorite supporting characters. Like, supporting cast members aren't usually ballyhooed quite that much when they're introduced.
And there's another example of why Marvel, from my perspective, was on the cutting edge in the Silver Age because they were emphasizing characterization in a way you weren't accustomed to, at least in superhero comics. Yeah. I mean, you think about the DC characters in the early Silver Age, when they had supporting characters, they're very one-dimensional, right? They kind of serve one purpose. And, like, think, what was the JLA mascot? What was that guy?
Snapper Carr.
Yeah, right? I mean, how developed was Snapper Carr, for example, right?
Yeah.
You know.
That's how.
I mean, he got it justly because of his lawn care with the lime, basically. He saved the world because, yeah, anyway.
He knew that lime killed starfish.
Yeah.
You're in.
Yeah.
Yes, saved us, kid.
So, now granted, these, like, to be even-handed, Pepper is a very one-dimensional, stereotypical female character in many ways, but
She at least had some spunk.
she had some spunk.
Hate spunk.
And she had a lot of interaction with Tony. I mean, she becomes a major character and someone for, let's face it, someone for Tony to talk to. Like, these steady characters are always there.
Yep, which was clearly something that they'd come to realize the strip needed.
Yes.
Because if you look back to the cover of that issue with Kala, number 43, she's threatening Tony's friends, and it's just a generic bunch of scientists and like military brass. So I guess they decided, he needs some real friends, friends that readers would care about, friends that are a believable emotional anchor for Tony Stark, as opposed to just these generic background characters.
And it's a testament to the strength of the characters that how much, again, when you have the roots of a great idea, they become very multidimensional, especially Pepper in the decades that followed. Where is Happy right now? I've lost track of him in Iron Man's comics. Is he still alive?
I don't know.
Maybe some of the forums can help us out. I've lost track of Happy Hogan as a character. So, now, issue 46.
Oh, we can't do that yet either,
Oh,
Chris.
Murd, you know what? My friend, I apologize.
Because number 45 is also the first appearance of a villain called at that time Jack Frost. The Icy Fingers of Jack Frost, that's the story's title. An 18-page super epic, says the cover. He would
So
eventually...
Iron Man must have already been selling pretty well then, if they gave him 18 pages.
Yep, given that extra space, which
Yeah.
is a big deal apparently, if it was a super epic at 18 pages. Jack Frost would eventually change his name to Blizzard. You know, some Marvel fans may know him better that way. His name was Grigor
Oh, right,
Shapanka.
the Blizzard, of course. I didn't think of that. Okay.
So he's been a long-standing Marvel character, although Grigor Shapanka, the original Jack Frost / Blizzard, has been dead for some time.
But when we think of the Blizzard in the, well, like with the blue and white costume, that's an
Right.
Iron Man rogue for many years. Yeah. Go ahead, sir. I'm sorry.
Yep. And so, well, yeah, his origin's pretty similar to Mr. Hyde from Journey into Mystery, an unscrupulous researcher who embezzled from his employers, in this case Stark Industries, to pursue his pet project, which was cryogenics, suspended animation. And when he was fired from Stark Industries, he rigged up this sort of cold blaster weapon and put on this deranged snowman-looking outfit. You know, the blue and white outfit you mentioned, Chris, is clearly an improvement.
Yeah.
Called himself Jack Frost and set out on a vendetta to destroy Stark Industries and loot it to get the funds he needs to complete his research into suspended animation. And so he became kind of a recurring rogue for Iron Man in the future.
Outstanding.
Now you may go on to Tales of Suspense number 46.
46. All right. First appearance, the Crimson Dynamo. Now, is it Ivan Vanko?
No, it's Anton Vanko.
Anton Vanko, who was a brilliant Soviet scientist. And he's told by Nikita Khrushchev, I shall bury Iron Man. I can't do a good Russian accent. I should have probably had you do that, Murd. Go ahead.
No, I'm on the spot.
Yeah,
I
come on,
apologize.
I shall bury Iron Man. That's no better. I'm channeling Paul Frees here.
Kiel Moose and Squirrel.
Exactly.
Now, remember, Nikita Khrushchev was the premier of the Soviet Union, all right, in the early to mid 1960s until he was overthrown in a bloodless coup. But so Vanko creates the Crimson Dynamo armor, which is like the Soviet version of Iron Man, basically. And he's ordered to attack Iron Man. But ultimately what happens is Vanko is persuaded by Iron Man to defect to the United States. So much to the chagrin of Khrushchev. And he switches sides. So, but Crimson Dynamo is a major Iron Man rogue from the Silver Age. Now, Murd, issue 47, I just want to turn this over to you.
Oh.
It's the first appearance of a favorite villain of yours.
Oh, true.
Go for it.
But first, in number 46, another important character that first appeared. Senator Harrington Byrd.
Ooh! Explain. Well done, sir. Well
Okay.
done.
Well, you probably know more about him than I do, but he's kind of like Iron Man's J. Jonah Jameson.
Yes.
He's a senator, a U.S. senator, and he's a bit of a war hawk, and he's kind of critical of the way Stark Industries handles its munitions business. You know,
And its secrets.
Yes.
Yeah.
He's always putting pressure on Tony Stark to reveal more secrets of, in particular, Iron Man's armor to the U.S. government. So
He's a cold warrior.
Yeah, he's
for sure.
constantly riding Stark for not being, I guess, hard enough or on the subject of war and not being transparent enough to the government so that they can profit from his genius.
Well done, sir.
So he's a recurring thing too. Now the Melter.
Go for it.
The second time I competed in the National Spelling Bee back in 1993, I met a kid named Chris Eberle from out in Chicago. He and I hung out in Washington, D.C. as we were competing in this spelling bee. He was big into comics. He had a bunch of issues of Mohatmu with him in his hotel room. And his favorite character in all of comics is the Melter. Or at least it was in
It's
1993.
like Secret Origins of Adam Murdoch.
How
Go
about
ahead.
that?
It's just fascinating to me that he was a cool kid too. We had fun those few days in Washington D.C. talking comics, and it was just fascinating to me that this villain, who had been dead for about 10 years by the time.
Scourge killed him, right?
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, he was one of the victims of Scourge.
Yes, yeah.
Disguised himself as the Melter's lab assistant and offed him. That a character like that could be somebody's favorite. Just goes to show you every character is somebody's favorite. So think before you slam the lame villains. But yeah, the Melter's real name was Bruno Horgan. He was a minor business rival of Anthony Stark's. He was in kind of the same business, but he was in danger of being shut down by the feds for using faulty materials in the things that he built. So in desperation to throw something together that would get his company out of the hot water it was in, he found one of his company's malfunctioning devices, and he discovered accidentally that it emitted a form of radiation or a pulse beam that liquefied iron. And so he was able to weaponize this. He mounted it on his chest, turned it into a projecting blaster, and ended up in battle with Iron Man because this weapon of his could melt the iron components in Iron Man's armor. Iron Man was able to foil him that time. There's a pun coming. By cobbling together a temporary suit of armor made of aluminum. Get it?
Yeah, I got it.
I'm looking
Good night,
at
everybody.
I'm looking at Brian here. This is
Shane's just grimacing.
so.
Well, it's funny to the people watching. I'm just looking at the screen, but really I'm watching Murd because he's here, but it's in the TV.
He's looking straight in front of himself to look at a guy who's sitting right to his left. But yeah, so the Melter would come back a few times, always modifying or having some of his underlings modify his Melter unit so that it would melt. It emitted different frequencies that would melt things other than just iron, even like wood, stone, human flesh. And in time, I think he might have at some point had the good sense to turn it into a handheld weapon too. But,
That rings a bell.
But at first, it was chest-mounted.
And he was around for a while until the Scourge, whacked him.
Mm-hmm. He was a member of the Masters of Evil for a time.
That's right.
You don't get bigger league than that in the annals of Marvel villainy.
He was also in JLA Avengers issue 3, it says here.
He was in what?
JLA Avengers issue 3.
Really?
Well, that was a reality bending.
Oh, that's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
Okay.
So it's-
Good old Kurt Busiek.
Uh-huh. Oh, yeah.
All right, Shane, if you call up the cover to issue 48 of Tales of Suspense, please. Now, this issue is very significant in Iron Man's history, as you mentioned, because it's when Steve Ditko introduces his design of the red and gold armor. Notice on the cover, the old Model 1, the gold version, is off to the side, and then Iron Man is crashing through the wall in his new armor, and the word balloon reads, "Iron Man is defeated. Now none can challenge the great Mr. Dahl." Murd, who the hell is
Great
Mr. Dahl?
Mr. Dahl. His real name was Nathan Dolly.
Oh my God.
And he was. I've known this for several years,
Yeah,
by the way. This,
no notes, by the way.
this is
Top
not
of
written
this-
on this sheet of paper in
No.
front of me. I just
Outstanding.
There's no Confederates in the audience.
nothing up the sleeve. Presto.
And he's watching, and there's baseball scores on
You
the
gotta get a new hat.
Yeah, he does need a new hat. You're absolutely right. So yeah, his name is Nathan Dolly. He was a collector of antiquities who got his hands on a wooden voodoo doll, basically, with mystic powers. It had the ability to change its shape to assume the likeness of any person Mr. Doll wished, and he could then control that person's actions. Later, by retcon, we learned that it was... Mr. Doll got this thing from an African witch doctor, but we later
course he
learned that
did.
it was made from the wood of a tree that grew on Wundagore Mountain, the same place the Puppet
Wundagore
Master
again.
got his radioactive clay that he was
Yes.
able to use to control people in just the same way that Mr. Dahl was able to control people with his little wooden fetish. So he was able to reconfigure it to look like Iron Man and control Iron Man's actions. And this is where we get the story-based reason why Iron Man adopted this new Steve Ditko designed armor, so that, Mr. Dahl is, his voodoo doll was shaped like the old Iron Man armor. So Iron Man figured if he put on a new armor and then got the drop on Mr. Dahl before he could reconfigure the voodoo doll to resemble the new armor, he could then disarm Mr. Dahl and overpower him.
You know, if we ever could go on a virtual tour of the Marvel Universe, Wendigo Mountain has to be a major stop because so much Marvel history going
kind of
back
a
to the
hot
Demon
spot,
Pawn is there. I mean, it's magnificent. Shane, if you pull up first red and gold armor image, please. I wanted to show this to the audience because this is classic Ditko. And you have the image, Shane? Mm-hmm. What I love about it is, and you see this in Spider-Man 2, Ditko was so attentive to giving you visual explanations of how a costume worked, per se. Think about all he did with Spider-Man, like with his belt and the cartridges and the web shooters and the light and all this. And this is a magnificent sequence where Tony is narrating for the audience how and why he is creating this new suit of armor and how how the advantages it'll give him in terms of putting it on and how it's superior to his old armor. I just think it's a classic example of why Ditko is one of the great masters of the Silver Age, because even though this is pure fantasy, he's creating a reality within that fantasy to try to kind of explain to you, like, this is why he's doing this and this is what it's going to do. And this is why it's superior to what you saw before. And just the imagination of the man, it's amazing. And Lee said this many times, I had the greatest artists in the business working for me. And boy, was he lucky for that. Because look at that page.
I've seen it before, but seeing it here, the way you have it presented, 3 pages, side by side, it's just wonderful to look at. You mentioned the sequencing. The one page has like 11 panels on it, just just shots of his hands and legs and feet,
showing how the malleable mesh is, emits from the gauntlets, and it's just Ditko.
Yeah,
I mean,
what can you say? Yeah.
One of the great masters. All right, issue 49 I think is fun because it's just the classic Marvel misunderstanding leads to a brawl.
No.
So, Angel of the X-Men, when they're in their blue and gold original Silver Age outfits, the original team, for whatever reason, he flies near an atomic test site, which Iron Man is involved in, and somehow, against all science and physics, Angel survives being near this. And he doesn't get radioactive poisoning or sickness. It's just his personality is transformed by his proximity to the blast, almost like a Jekyll and Hyde, and he becomes, diabolical, and he ends up having to fight Iron Man, so you get to see Iron Man fight the Angel, and eventually Iron Man helps him restore his proper personality. So, I always remember this issue. I had it once in my inventory. It fetched a high price. Apparently, this is a TOS issue you don't see that often when you go through back. That's my memory of it. You go through because I've only owned it once in my career as a retailer. I remember I sold it for a fairly good amount of money to a long-standing wall book customer. So that's definitely one of the higher-end TOS issues from the Silver Age. Because again, it has an X-Men appearance in it. Because I remember correctly, the rest of the X-Men do appear in the story. All right, 50's huge. Issue 50 is one of the most important Iron Man stories of the Silver Age. The first appearance of the Mandarin. Now, as we mentioned earlier, the Mandarin, I mean, you talk about coming right from the realm of Fu Manchu. I mean, this is pretty much a lot of the stereotypes you can think of like the old-fashioned, like, Asiatic villain. You find in the Mandarin, right down to the fact that he's a descendant of Genghis Khan, apparently. Murray, why don't you give us a little bit of background on Mandarin and his rings and so forth, please?
Okay. Well, yeah, you have it down in your notes here that his origin is retold at a later time.
Yes.
But yeah, he was an official of the Chinese government pre-communist revolution. who lost his position as a result of that. So he began using his inventive genius to try to, devise things that would possibly restore him to a position of power, became a kind of crime lord. At one point, he ventured into the forbidden Valley of Spirits, where he sought the legendary Palace of the Star Dragon. All products of how Stan Lee imagines Chinese peasants would view superstitiously actual phenomena. But it turns out that the Palace of the Star Dragon is a spaceship. It's a giant spaceship that crashed into an area of China that experiences a lot of natural fog. And so it's local superstition has kept most of the Chinese peasants from venturing there, but not the Mandarin. He goes in there, he raids this thing for its technology. It turns out that, I think this is much later established, that Fin Fang Foom, the classic Marvel monster, the giant dragon with the purple pants, he was a crew member of this starship.
You're right, you're right. I remember that now. Yeah, that's much later.
Yep,
yeah.
an alien race called the Makluans. And the captain of this ship was an entity called Axon Kar.
Yes.
And so the Mandarin raids Axon Kar's starship, and he finds these 10 circular, annular bands of metal, each of which I think they were part of the ship's star drive or something, and he's able to fashion them into weapons, each of which has a different power and property.
The 10 rings.
Yes, the 10 rings of the Mandarin. Now, I did actually write these down.
Oh, please.
Okay, so on the left hand, little finger ring, Ice Blast. Ring finger left hand, Mento Intensifier. Middle finger of the left hand, Electroblast. Index finger, Flame Blast. And the thumb, White Light. Okay, little finger of the right hand, Black Light. Ring finger of the right hand, Disintegration Beam. I keep pointing
Don't point that at me.
Sorry.
Zap.
Middle finger, right hand, Vortex Beam. Index finger, Impact Beam, which is similar, I would assume, to the repulsor rays on Iron Man's armor. And the biggie on the thumb of the right hand, Matter Rearranger. Possibly the most powerful and versatile of the lot.
I'm gonna rearranger you.
Sounded just like Jamie when he said that.
Did I?
Rearranger you. So, yeah, he can do a lot of stuff, can the Mandarin.
And I'm sorry, Murray, go ahead.
And he uses these powers, plus his natural inborn technological genius, to carve out a little niche as a crime lord, whose interests kind of run counter, I think, to the communist regime.
He's not. In fact, he is not. He's not working for the communist Chinese government. He's like a warlord unto himself, essentially.
Right.
And I think the communists actually fear him, essentially. I mean, he's on with those rings. He's almost like a supernatural being. And I mean, when you look at the Mandarin's early appearances, he has the famous purple sort of face mask,
the head
and
mask and the long robes,
the green robes,
the
and so
talon-like
forth.
fingernails.
Yeah, and they paint him. He's very yellow. His skin, the yellow peril, and that stereotype. And as you look at the Mandarin through the decades, because he's widely seen as Iron Man's arch enemy, he starts out as a very Ming the Merciless, Fu Manchu, that very stereotypical, as I said, the Asiatic villain you'd see in pulp fiction. As the years progress, though, he becomes a very complex and frankly terrifying villain. And I think about when Fraction did his Invincible Iron Man run. Have you guys read the Fraction Invincible Iron Man?
No.
Some of the best Iron Man comics I think ever done. Fraction does an annual. I think it's annual 1. Someone can help me on the forums. It's just it's the story of the Mandarin. And in the story, the Mandarin kidnaps this very famous Chinese, I think he's a Chinese filmmaker, to force him to tell his life story. And then you get different versions of what is the Mandarin's life story. It's an amazing one-and-done issue from Fraction's Iron Man run. It's an annual. And it just shows the agenda and the ruthlessness of the Mandarin character. And as you go through Iron Man's history, the Mandarin goes from sort of this, very stereotypical, as I said, pulp villain to this almost corporate overlord who has his hands on all kinds of machinations and, obviously deeply hates Tony Stark. So this is a character, when we return to Iron Man in future spotlights down the road, we're going to hear a lot more of him. And I think he kind of ups Iron Man's rogues gallery considerably, especially as they develop the character or time. Anything else you want to say about the Mandarin, Murd?
Not at this juncture.
All right. Now, Murd, issue 51, Marvel introduces their version of the Scarecrow. Could you elaborate on him a little bit, please?
Okay. Well, his real name is Ebenezer Lawton or Lafton. Laughton. I've never been quite sure how to pronounce it. But he's a professional stage contortionist.
Of course.
Because, those things exist. But he was performing in a live variety show when he witnessed Iron Man chasing like a bank robber or something. And he decides he's inspired by this to use his power of double-jointedness for his own personal gain. So he steals a flock of trained crows and goes into business as a burglar. And he decides, completely at random, for his first big high-profile job as the Scarecrow, to rob the penthouse. Oh, let's see, picking name out of the air, Anthony Stark, that rich playboy. Bad move.
Is Scarecrow did he have other appearances?
Plenty.
He did, okay.
Oh,
I wasn't
yeah,
sure about that.
yeah, many times. Yeah, he became, in the 90s, they reimagined him pretty thoroughly. Brought him closer to DC's Scarecrow, actually, in that he actually gained pheromonal fear powers.
See, I'm recalling a Marvel Bronze Age
Oh,
house book, Dead of Night.
yes.
Was that the same Scarecrow?
No, not at all, not
Okay.
at all.
That's
no.
what I thought. All right.
Now, that was a supernatural, other-dimensional being who was eventually brought in by Roy Thomas during his Doctor Strange run as one of the Fear Lords, along with characters like Nightmare and Despair and Calicu the Fear Eater and so on.
Magnificent.
Roy Thomas was a thorough guy.
Yes, he was.
Still
Now,
is.
So's the Murd.
one of the most important issues in Iron Man Silver Age 1, and I dare
Say the number.
issue 52.
52!
And you know what, Pants? That I'm ashamed they went by me.
You didn't catch that?
I will
I'm sitting
supplicate
right
and
here.
ask for forgiveness later.
Yeah.
Now,
You won't get it, but
jeez. All right, we'll talk about that later.
Uh-huh.
Now, this is the first appearance of Natasha Romanoff, the Black Widow.
dun, dun, dun.
Now, Shane, if you could bring up issue 52's cover,
Already did
please.
it.
You know what,
Already did it.
Shane? I should have known.
I'm on the ball.
I
They don't give these shows to chimps, you know.
I
can't do much
I feel
in
like I have
the-
to commit ritual seppuku at the end.
I can't do much in these spotlight episodes when I haven't read the books, but I can hit a button.
Yeah.
You know you're a tonic for my spirit. Come on.
Tonic.
Be here. Now, look at the cover, everybody. That is not the Black Widow we are familiar with by any stretch of the
No,
imagination.
it's not.
No, that's
And-
more, what's her name from Rock and
Boris and
Bullwinkle.
Natasha?
No,
Yeah.
Natasha Fatale, right.
You've got the veil over the eyes. You've got the, like the.
The stole.
It's almost like a mirror universe version of like a Jackie Kennedy outfit, basically. The hat and she's like the classic femme fatale, Cold War spy. All right, and when we think of the the Black Widow, who I hope they eventually give her. She should get a movie of
She
herself.
should have had her own movie by now.
Yeah,
Long since.
That's an
Yeah.
oversight, to be sure, or at least Netflix or something.
Yeah.
But the Black Widow we know, we're nowhere near that at this point. This is a very rote, seductress, femme fatale, sinister, communist spy.
Seems also like high society rich.
Well, that's part of her allure because in the story, Khrushchev is incensed that Vanko has defected to the capitalists. And he sends the Black Widow to basically kill Vanko and Stark. And of course, the Widow tries to seduce Tony because Tony is taken by her beauty, as everybody is. And that's one of her weapons as an espionage agent. And in the story, Vanko actually sacrifices himself to save Stark, and he dies.
Right, because the Soviet government sends along the second Crimson Dynamo.
That's right.
Yes, a guy named Boris Sturgenev, I think. And so Vanko, in battle with his successor as Crimson Dynamo, he sacrifices himself, and I think both of characters end up dead.
Does the Crimson Dynamo return, though, in the future?
Many
so.
times. There's been like 10 different guys in the armor.
That's what I thought.
It's like Rocket Red.
Because in the movie Iron Man 2, don't they kind of combine Whiplash and the
Yes,
Crimson
they
Dynamo?
do.
Look
It
at
was a
Bird's eyes now.
terrible,
Rage.
terrible,
I'm right there with
idea.
him on that.
I mean, it's regarded
Because
as
Whiplash
one of.
was Vanko's son, right? In the movie, isn't that what they did?
Yeah, no.
I think they just called him Anton Vanko.
Okay.
The guy who was Anton Vanko Whiplash in the movie also built the armor, Crimson Dynamo-ish. believe.
He was Whiplash and the Dynamo in both of the
Yes.
movies, because I remember in the early part of the movie, he's talking about his father,
Right.
who he felt Stark had betrayed.
Oh, right. And then I think it was in season 1 of Agent Carter, we actually saw Anton Vanko the first.
Yes,
in
we did.
the United States, working for Howard Stark.
Yes, we did.
I believe.
Oh God, I forgot about that.
Oh, that's a great little
Good
Easter egg.
clutch moment, Murd. God, that show was so good. I'm so disappointed it was
Not picked
canceled.
up for a 3rd season.
Still might come back though.
I hope so.
But we digress.
Yeah.
So we
Now, Shane, call issue 53, please. The Black Widow's not down for long, because she's got to make up for the fact that she failed her Soviet masters. So she returns in issue 53.
With
This is
shocking hands?
What's that?
With shocking hands?
Looks like she's some kind of magnetic weapon.
I shall magnetize you with my hands.
No, actually, it says here she's trying to steal Tony's anti-gravity device,
Ah.
which probably has written anti-gravity device on the side of it, based on what Murd said before about that other piece of technology.
Okay.
But there she's again, like her cocktail dress and the
High
Jackie Kennedy
heels.
hat, and of course she has the fur. Just what a covert intelligence agent should wear out in the field.
Sure, sure.
For example.
Battling a American superhero. Yeah.
But she's the classic Soviet agent, the femme fatale. Notice, by the way, just interesting Marvel history in the same issue, the origin of the Watcher.
I saw that.
Yeah. So, the Watcher had some backup stories in the Silver Age as well.
He did, yeah.
Yeah. Now, Black Widow, of course, fails in this mission, but she'll return shortly. 54, 55, is more Mandarin. The Mandarin comes back repeatedly during the Silver Age and beyond. Murd, I want to ask you about issue 56. I've forgotten. Who was the Unicorn?
Ah, the Unicorn.
I knew you'd know.
One of my favorite silly Silver Age
Go for
Marvel
it.
villains. Okay, he's a Soviet agent. His real name was Miloš Masaryk. Czechoslovakian born, because in those days there actually was such a political entity as
Batman is
Czechoslovakia.
Bruce
Behind
Wayne.
the Iron Curtain.
Right, part
So-
of the
Satellite
communist
Soviet
bloc.
Union, Yeah.
But yeah, he ended up in the KGB, and he was actually assigned to security detail as the bodyguard for Anton Vanko as he was working on the Crimson Dynamo armor. And as a side project, Vanko was also working on something he called a power horn, which was a helmet with sort of a projector device mounted on it that was able to fire weaponized beams of radiation. Head-mounted, not the smartest design choice, since this source of deadly radiation situated
brain.
right next to
Yeah.
the
It only
wielder's
hurts outward.
brain.
not inward, just out.
So
It
not
only goes this way.
surprisingly, when he's finished up with his 2 big projects here, he says, "Okay, I think I'm going to keep this suit of armor for myself. And you bodyguard guy, how would you like to wear this helmet with a radioactive dildo sticking out of the forehead? You just take that, and I'm just going to keep this armor for myself." So Masaryk went to his Soviet superiors, got official permission to wear this thing in the service of the Soviet cause, and he was dispatched to the U.S. I think to retrieve Vanko. I guess not having received intelligence that Vanko had already died a few issues earlier, and that's how he came in conflict with Iron Man for the first time. He was codenamed the Unicorn because he had this horn-like thing that fired radiation sticking out of his head.
Now, he appeared in Iron Man several times, didn't he?
Oh, yes, yes,
Now,
and
was he
his-
killed by Scourge?
No,
No,
he was
okay.
not. His powers were modified a couple of times. At
Yeah.
some point, he volunteered for some experiment that hyperactivated his musculature.
Of course.
And so, as a result of that, and of course the radiation thing next to his brain, he suffered a couple different degenerative disorders over the years. And I think that is what eventually killed him. I'm pretty sure Miloš Masaryk is no longer with us, but there have been 1 or 2 other unicorns since then.
I can almost hear somebody going, "Well, here's a nice hat. Isn't that special?"
The church lady?
yeah, the church lady. That's totally what. Here's a nice little hat for you.
All right, let's take a moment and
All right.
acknowledge the importance of the book that's coming up next.
Yes.
For me, this is a key Marvel Silver Age book. It's a book that I'm sure Pants is going to continue to increase in value, and I can only imagine what some of the art is worth for it. Issue 57 by Lee, and these are all Don Heck drawn, all these issues we're talking about, entitled Hawkeye the Marksman. And this is the first appearance of Hawkeye, and the Black Widow returns in this issue as well. Now, if you look at the cover, you have it up, Shane? I know. I thank you, my brother.
He's got one job.
I put the button.
Right from the get-go, I think Hawkeye is one of the coolest costumes of all the Marvel
Yeah,
heroes. And you can tell. I mean, this is Hex design. You know, that sort of Robin Hood, you know, almost Three Musketeers slash feel to it. I love the mask. I just think it's a dynamic costume, and I mean, they've gotten rid of it now because of the movie and all that stuff.
Well, even so, though, what was it, the second Avengers or maybe even Civil War, without the mask, that's a lot closer than some things I've seen, like the way Hawkeye's
that's true.
costume is in the movie.
And this costume, I mean, they modify a little. They've given him sometimes like some chainmail, but it's basically been this costume, more or less. After the face mask, like the front projected up more, but it's basically been this costume for much of the character's history until you get into the 21st century, essentially. And it's Hawkeye's first appearance. Now, when we don't think of Hawkeye as the very fleshed out character we know today. This is the beginning of that character. But even in the beginning, I think Lee was onto something, because he doesn't make Hawkeye an outright villain. He's a trick shot artist in a circus, and he's mistaken for a jewel thief. So he ends up on the run, and he's seduced by the Black Widow. He uses him as a cat's paw in her agenda against Tony Stark. So he's not really, even at this early stage, he's an adversary of Iron Man, but he's really not a villain, per se. And actually, Shane, if you could call up the poor Hawkeye panel.
There we go.
You have it up? Mm-hmm. So here's the, and this is a later appearance, but here it's also in the same Silver Age. Here's the Black Widow speaking to him. With Iron Man, I came to the accent. With Iron Man gone, this is your chance to raid Stark's factory again and steal the plans for his newest weapons. Now, notice the way, like, you would never imagine Hawkeye speaking this way today, the character. I have agreed to be your ally, my lovely Black Widow, but my heart rebels at the thought of treason. It will not be treason, my bold hero. I only serve the cause of international peace. And then she's thinking, he believes any lie I tell him.
Because I'm so beautiful and he is not.
And in these early stories, Hawkeye is a dupe of Natasha. And she's basically using him, although over time they developed that she really did have feelings for him, but she's basically using him in her cause as a Soviet intelligence agent. So, you know, Hawkeye's kind of like the sap, basically. He's not really a bad guy, but he's the world's greatest archer, and they already introduced a lot of the trick arrows and so forth. What do you think of this cover, Pants? I love the cover to Tales of Suspense 57.
Yep. The different images.
Yeah,
of,
it's just a dynamic
Hawkeye
cover.
all around him, yeah.
And he and Natasha become partners, and we'll return to them in a little bit. Now, issue 58. I had this as a large poster in my store that's framed in the back area. To me, this is one of the most iconic covers of the Marvel Silver Age. What do you think, Pants?
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Do you know if this exists as original art?
I don't know.
Okay. It's a Kirby cover, obviously. In mortal combat with Captain America. Now, remember, Kirby did a lot of the covers, even on books he wasn't working on regularly, and I think this is one of his most famous Silver Age covers. And when you think about the Civil War movie, you can tell they were inspired by this. Because when they're fighting in that movie, some of the poses they take are really iconic, and they just have that Silver Age feel to them. You know what I'm talking about, right, Shane?
Oh, yeah.
And now, Heck is doing the interiors, and they bring back one of Spider-Man's earliest rogues, the Chameleon, who's always up to pesky trouble. And the Chameleon dupes Iron Man because he impersonates Captain America. And again, the classic Marvel misunderstanding, so the heroes will fight, and then the real Captain America and Iron Man end up in a Donnybrook because Iron Man thinks it's the Chameleon.
Love the word Donnybrook, yes.
Here to serve, brother. But the fight ends inconclusive because Tony's draining power and he's weakening. Luckily, fellow Avengers Giant Man and Wasp step in and they help clear up the confusion, and everybody parts as pals. But that tricky Chameleon was the one who got this whole altercation in motion. But that cover, I have a huge frame image of it in the store. I love this cover. To me, this is just such an epitome of Kirby. Like Iron Man's blow, like how the fist is almost going right towards the audience. The dynamic poses. It's vintage Jack Kirby. Any comments on the art pants? Or
No, I was just trying to find the image of the original, and it's not readily found. If it exists, I'm sure it's some in black hole collection. You'll never see the light of day.
Probably true.
Until the person passes away, and then all bets are off.
Murd, issue 59 introduces another mainstay Marvel Silver Age villain, the Nathan Garrett Black Knight.
Actually, no, he first appeared in Tales of to Astonish.
Oh, please correct me, sir. Go ahead.
Well, yeah, he fought Giant Man and the Wasp before he showed up
Okay,
here.
my mistake then. Go ahead.
Okay.
Giant Man and the
Keep it moving, keep it moving.
He was a descendant of the heroic Sir Percy of
Who
Scandia.
you saw in the classic Joe
course he
Manili
was.
Atlas Black Knight comic.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So it's a historical Marvel / Atlas character,
Right.
sort like a chivalry character from the days of King Arthur. And his modern day descendant, however, is a bit of a black sheep in the family. He proves unworthy of the heroic heritage of the family. So instead of inheriting the mystic black blade passed down through the generations,
blade.
he invents his own power lance weapon, I think, and becomes the criminal Black Knight. He even genetically engineers his own winged horse.
And a member of the Masters of Evil, if I remember correctly.
You absolutely
And
do.
Dane Whitman, the heroic Black Knight, is a relative of his,
His
correct?
nephew, yes.
And doesn't Garrett die and he passes on?
Mm-hmm. All of his effects, including his castle.
But he's remorseful, isn't he, at the end of his life?
Yes.
Yeah.
He does kind of feel that in passing all of this on to his nephew and wishing for him a better and more worthy life than Nathan Garrett.
I always
himself
loved it, just the. I mentioned Joe Manili. Joe Manili was, if he died tragically in a train accident in the 50s. He was one of Stan Lee's go-to artists in the Atlas era. Magnificent artist. If you see his Black Knight Atlas comics, they are stunning. The artwork in those. I don't know if you guys have seen the Atlas Black Knight comics. They are gorgeous. And it's widely believed if Manili had lived, he would have been a major artist in the Marvel age. And he and Stan Lee actually worked on a newspaper strip together. And he'd lost his glasses in the city, and he stepped between two train cars and was killed.
Jeez.
And apparently, when his body was recovered, he was still clutching his art portfolio. He was a tremendous artist, a great loss. But that character that you're talking about, Garrett, comes out, like you said, out of the Atlas era Black Knight, and then Dane Whitman follows him. So I love the whole Black Knight history in the Marvel universe. It's fantastic. Now,
And let's mention in passing, too,
Please.
that number 59 of the Tales of Suspense is the first that co-stars Captain America and Iron Man.
oh,
As
God, Mert, I
co-features.
missed that. Well done. That's when they have Iron Man introducing Cap on the cover. He's like standing, extending his arm, and Cap bursts through in classic Kirby fashion. Well done, sir. I want to read a quote from issue 60 because this is a good example of Tony, as even in the Silver Age, as a tormented character. He's speaking here. I haven't the courage to remove my iron armor. I don't dare gamble with my damaged heart. I'm a prisoner of Iron Man, of my own creation. And in these stories, Pepper and Happy don't know yet that Tony is Iron Man, and Tony keeps disappearing. And they're worried about his health, and they just can't seem to find him, and that becomes a running subplot. Issue 60, Blackwood and the Hawkeye return again to make mischief. Issue 61, entitled The Death of Tony Stark. And Tony is in his mansion, which I think is on Long Island, and he has to wear the armor because his heart is weak. And Happy comes, so Tony hides under the sheets in his bed, so Happy can't find him in the Iron Man armor. And then the Mandarin uses a satellite to obliterate Stark's mansion. And everybody thinks Tony is dead because Iron Man, and remember, I should have mentioned this earlier. You all know this. What is the main fiction Tony maintains about Iron Man?
It's his bodyguard.
It's his bodyguard. It's not him. It's some other guy who serves him as his bodyguard. So when the Iron Man emerges from the mansion, Pepper's like, you killed him. They think Tony's dead, essentially. And issue 62, they give you the origin of the Mandarin that Murd relayed before. And the Mandarin again becomes a major rogue of Iron Man. In issue 63, Tony resurfaces. Obviously, he's not dead. And Tony realizes, I love Pepper, but I can't be with her. I had this heart affliction, and I'm Iron Man. I can never give that kind of life to her. And even though he loves her, he acts cold towards her to push her towards Happy, essentially, Happy Hogan. And eventually they will elope and get married. Well, that will not work out.
I'm glad they didn't do that in the movies yet.
No, I don't think No, because I love Jon Favreau's interpretation of Happy.
Oh,
But
yeah.
it wouldn't work.
No.
Like the chemistry's not there
Nope.
at all. Issue 64, the Black Widow gets a costume. Up to this point, she's been wearing the cocktail dress and the hat with the veil and the fur. Now she has kind of like a fishnet, almost kind of like a Black Canary type costume. I think it even says like W on it or something like that. And she has a
Fishnet is
Letter B.
letter B, thank you. And she has a mask.
The Roman letter B.
And they have her like, clinging to walls and ceilings and so forth. She has like a wire and so forth. And she and Hawkeye again are trying to foil Tony's agenda. The Soviets send her to kill Iron Man. She fails, of course. Happy proposes to Pepper, and they're held hostage by the Black Widow and Hawkeye, but they are freed. It's at this point, by the way, that Hawkeye will start to move towards the heroic character, because eventually when we get to the Avengers and Cap's kooky quartet, Hawkeye will move over into there, away from the Black Widow. So, now, I think issue 65 is hilarious. So in this story, a common burglar penetrates Stark security, and he finds, laid out in the open, Tony's attaché case with the Iron Man armor in it, which the burglar gets and dons. The most high-tech munitions manufacturer in the world.
Yeah, look what I found.
And he's just, it's
picking a
all laid
lock.
out there. And
I waltzed
Tony
right
has
in.
to use the old Model 1 gold armor to take down this burglar. But because of his experience, he's able to overcome his newer armor and defeat the guy. So it's just a fun way to have the two versions of Iron Man basically fight each other. Issue 66, Atuma.
Who's going to say it?
It's not a tumor.
There you go. There you go.
Bravo, Pants. Bravo.
I put him up and he knocks him out of the park.
Little T-ball there.
Just a little.
Now, Murd, Atuma, of course, as we know, was a barbarian warlord of Atlantis and a perennial foe of Submariner.
True.
An Atlantean, though, correct?
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
One
yeah.
of the blue-skinned Atlanteans.
Yes. But a rival for the throne, essentially.
Yes.
Yeah.
Just as you said, he's like a barbarian warlord. He's larger and stronger than the average barbarian,
Yes.
but not as strong as the Avenging Sun.
And he wears that rabbit ear headgear.
Yeah. I've always sort of thought of it more as bat wings, but then again, what do people who live underwater know about bat wings?
Good point.
So maybe they're supposed to
Stronger
be
than the ever.
sawfish snouts? I don't know.
Again, it's an example of how, right from the get-go, Lee and the artists are interconnecting everything. Villains who appeared in other comics, Fantastic Four, Submariner, now they're appearing in Iron Man. Right? There's Hawkeye will end up in the Avengers. That's what is exciting people. This integrated world in real-world settings is manifesting before their eyes. They read from month to month, which I'm sure was very exciting for readers at the time. Now, issue 67, Where Walks the Villains? Good old Count Nefaria, who first appeared in the X-Men, if I remember correctly.
I want to say Avengers.
We can check that. It's one or the other.
Avengers issue 13.
And then he appeared in X-Men later. Yeah, that's
He
it.
sure did, yes.
Yeah. Nefaria uses a dream machine, as it's called, which inserts nightmares into the person who's sleeping that are so powerful, ultimately could possibly kill them. And this is a great device by which they can have Iron Man in his nightmares fight his entire rogues gallery. And he heroically defeats it, and he overloads the machine and destroys it. And he's therefore saved from dying in his nightmares, essentially. So a fun way to see Iron Man fight all of his rogues at one time in this fantasy realm, essentially. Issue 68 is significant for the first appearance of Tony's ne'er-do-well cousin, Morgan Stark, who is a perennial charlatan, gambler, bum, essentially, who kind of tries to leech off Tony and his name and reputation. So,
And in that same issue, Iron Man fights aliens.
do you remember which kind? I forgot which kind.
Oh, they were called the Froma, as in fromage, the French word for cheese. And
No, we are the aliens
It
of
was-
cheese. Zootalo.
it was a cheesy story. Self-consciously so, because like representatives of that race seen in this issue were named things like Uda, like Gouda,
Oh my
and
God.
Edam, and like
This is my
names of
friend
actual
Gouda.
varieties of cheese. So it was guest written by a guy named Al Hartley. So it was a fill-in story.
I've heard the name of Al Hartley before. Yeah.
I think he was aware of how silly a premise Iron Man versus aliens really was, so he was kind of subtly foregrounding the cheesiness of the whole thing.
You gotta respect
They must
that.
have
You
come
gotta
from the
respect
moon.
It's getting late. We're getting punchy.
that. Issue 69.
Almost the witching
We were
hour.
getting
Murd,
punchy.
another key at first appearance villain, Titanium Man. And he ends it. You want to add about him?
Are you hearing the Wings song going through your head, Brian?
I'm not, but now that you mentioned it, I probably should. Yes. Yeah.
Oh, that's
Magneto
right.
and
The
the-
And the
McCartney
Crimson
song.
Dynamo came along for the ride. Yeah, so Titanium Man was really
done.
Boris Bulsky, who was not a scientist or an inventor. He was a politician, a functionary of the Soviet government, who had fallen out of favor with his superiors and had been reassigned to a Siberian work camp. But assigned there with him were some scientists who had worked under the Crimson Dynamo, Anton Vanko, and so he ordered them to use whatever they'd learned of Vanko's designs and whatever they'd learned of Tony Stark, well, the Iron Man armor's designs, to try and cobble together something that would be a Soviet equivalent of Iron Man, superior to the Crimson Dynamo. Make it out of solid titanium was his request. That was part of his commission, and so they built. So it would be stronger in theory than the Iron Man armor, but because this is the Soviet Union in the '60s, the end result ended up being much larger and bulkier and heavier than the Iron Man armor. In theory, stronger and more durable, simply by virtue of the material of which it was made, than the Iron Man armor, but this was more than negated by its lack of maneuverability.
Not as versatile. Yeah.
Yes. So he then, after having this armor constructed for him, he donned it himself, did Boris Bulsky, and issued a public challenge to Iron Man. The United States versus the USSR.
Commies versus the capitalists, to be
Yes.
televised worldwide.
Yes, which is a perfect
Throwdown.
allegory for the U.S.-Soviet arms race,
Exactly.
with a notable American nationalist slant, of course.
And Senator Byrd, as you mentioned, demands that Iron Man meet the challenge, stand up for democracy and capitalism, and take on the Titanium Man. And this story goes through a couple issues. In issue 70, while this is going on, Happy is nearly killed. And you think he's going to die, and he reveals that he knew Tony was Iron Man all along, and he always kept a secret. In issue 71, classic cover, What Price Victory? And the Titanium Man is defeated by Iron Man.
A 3-issue story.
Yes, which Marvel was also in the vanguard of that, these multi-part, and they would get longer and longer as the years progressed. Now, in issue 72, Senator Byrd, always the pain in the ass, tells Tony, you got to come to Congress. I'm subpoenaing you. You got to come to Congress and reveal the secrets of the Iron Man armor for the sake of national security. And Tony says, I can't do that. He refuses. Issue 73, very important artistically. Adam Austin begins penciling Tales of Suspense, the Iron Man feature. Now, Adam Austin was a pen name for Pants.
Gene Colan,
Gene
which
Colan.
I
Now-
actually did not remember that.
All right. Now, do we know why Colan did that? Other artists did the same thing. Because some of these artists also wanted to work with DC,
Oh, that's right.
and they didn't
that's
want to
right.
alienate one company over the other because they needed the work. So several of these guys took on these aliases so they could try to fool the publisher or the audience, or because so they could expand their workload and their money-making ability. So Colan, for a while, when he first started Marvel, because he wanted to protect whatever contacts he had in other companies, was Adam Austin. But when you see the work, it's frickin' Gene Colan. I mean, no one else can draw like that, essentially.
Back to Senator Byrd for
Yeah.
a minute. I'm surprised, given what he's doing in this time frame and the attention to detail that they have in the movies in some fashion, they didn't use him for Senator Stern.
the Gary Shandling
Yeah,
character.
because that would have made a little bit more sense to tie something back to old Iron Man stories, unless there's a Senator Stern out there in Iron Man books that comes about, but
Not that I know off the top of my head, that doesn't mean there isn't.
it still would have been kind of interesting.
Byrd,
to
was
use Byrd.
Senator Byrd the same senator who was in Kree-Skrull War? Who was masquerading, was a Skrull masquerading as a
I
politician?
don't think so.
Okay, that was a different senator then. Okay. All right, and Byrd keeps coming back to be a problem for Tony. Now, In issues 74 to 75, the Black Knight kidnaps Happy, who did not die. He's recovering from his injuries. Iron Man ends up in a tight spot, and Pepper, who's increasingly capable as a supporting character, helps rescue him. Stark is trying to help Happy recover, but he inadvertently transforms into a being called the Freak, who Tony then has to restrict. It's the classic, oh crap, I've turned my friend into this monster, now I have to stop, essentially.
Yep. The title of this story is "If This Guilt Be Mine."
Classic Lee hyperbole. Murd, I'm sure you'd like issue 76, the first appearance of Ultimo. Significance?
Well, it's well, in a way, Ultimo is kind of similar to Gargantus, the robot caveman.
Created by the Mandarin, correct?
No, just discovered by the Mandarin.
Discovered by the Mandarin,
He's
okay.
another alien doomsday weapon that somehow found its way to Earth. He's just this giant metal skeleton, basically. He's got a skull-like visage, and at first he's wearing one of those little skirt loincloth things that all Marvel anatomically incorrect bad guys.
Of course.
Any Marvel character that was not explicitly clothed needed to have something like that. That's why we ended up with a giant dragon with little purple pants.
Come on, the comics code, baby.
Right. So, yeah. But, yeah, he's just this giant killer robot that Mandarin found and was able to control somehow.
And yet Donald Duck could run free with no pants.
Go figure that.
It's true.
It's true. He's in comics, no pants.
Eventually they put pants on Howard the Duck, now that I think about it. He didn't have them at
Mickey
first,
Mouse had no top.
but in later,
Donald had
yeah,
no pants.
yeah. Later issues, Howard did have pants, but that way down the road.
Pluto wore nothing at all but a collar.
All right, issue 76. So the Mandarin tries to use Ultimo to destroy Iron Man. Happy recovers. In the next couple issues, 77, 78, magnificent colon artwork. Iron Man defeats Ultimo, but the government closes down Stark's plant in Flushing, Stark Industries, because he's defying the government's order to turn over the secrets of the Iron Man armor. And issue 79, Bird issues a warrant for Tony's arrest, because he's in contempt, essentially. And in that issue, in a cliffhanger, Iron Man is attacked by both Krang, another warlord foe of Namor, and the Submariner himself. Now, in issue 80, I think it's fair to say that Namor tends to fly off the handle sometimes without fully getting the full picture of a situation.
No.
And
Not our Namor.
Namor is ticked because, Krang was another warlord who was trying to usurp him, correct, Murd?
Yeah, I think he was like the Grand Vizier or something in Namor's court
Or a
at first.
general of some kind.
Yeah, and then, he attempted a coup
Yeah,
and,
and
was exiled for
In
it.
this story, the Lady Dorma, who was Namor's great love, I don't know the background here. For some reason, she's with Krang. I don't know if she's pretending to be. I don't remember the bit. Someone can help us out on the forums, the background of that, because Dorma was Namor's great love. She dies later. But Namor is pursuing them, and Iron Man inadvertently gets in the way, and then, of course, a fight breaks out, which continues in Tales to Astonish 82. So they have a little mini crossover there back in the Silver Age. But, of course, the battle ends inconclusively. There's no clear victor, and Namor goes off to continue his quest to go after Krang. Now, as Murd mentioned, issues 81 and 83, the Titanium Man comes back. They send him, is it the same guy in the armor?
Same guy.
All right, to destroy Iron Man. And if you could call up issue 83's cover, please. Because I just think this is definitive colon.
Yeah, not that one.
I just got to get to the
You got it up, brother? When I think about Gene Colan, this is one of the covers when I think of his superhero stuff, this is one of the covers I think of. Just first of all, just the hyperbolic victory. And they show just a heroic, magnificent Iron Man with one double-fisted blow, just felling the Titanium Man and just shattering, the outer carapace of his armor. I mean, look at that Colan artwork. Look how dynamic that work is. I mean, just Gene Colan, what a distinctive style. No one else drew like that. I mean, I revere this man's work. I'm so grateful I met him at the first New York Comic-Con, that fire hazard con where you couldn't get in and out, basically. And I was lucky enough to get a Howard the Duck sketch from him, which, of course, is hanging proudly in my shop ever since. And in the Jamie D. Tribute episode, he talked about meeting Gene Colan, and such an important artist.
Yeah.
And this cover is a testament just how dynamic his artwork was. All right, now, in issue 84, Tony finally surrenders himself to the Senate, and he dramatically collapses from a heart attack right in the Senate chamber. And when they're coming to help him, they open up his shirt. The chest plate is exposed. Doesn't mean they think he's Iron Man, but they realize now this guy needs this chest plate to live, essentially. And good old faithful Happy throws off suspicion. He appears in the Iron Man armor simultaneously, so no one then connects that chest plate and Stark to the Iron Man persona. Good old Happy.
Sort of like Alfred appearing as Batman.
Yeah, right.
Oh, God.
Standing across the street.
Fantastic. Now,
I've got a cold.
Now, in issue 85, because Happy's masquerade as Iron Man, the Mandarin kidnaps him. And Happy, of course, cannot handle the Mandarin. And Tony builds a more powerful version of the Model 3 armor. So again, updating the armor to save Happy. In the following issue, the Mandarin is seemingly killed by his own missile, of course, will return. And issue 87-88, one of the more tragic Marvel villains, we mentioned him before, the Mole Man appears. And Stark is testing an atomic-powered earth-boring device, which, of course, someone like the Mole Man who lives in a subterranean lair with his moloids would not be happy about. And, they get into an altercation. The Mole Man seemingly dies. And notice I always use the word seemingly when describing the deaths of all these villains because, for the most part, they're going to come back. Yeah. But would it be fair to say the Mole Man really isn't a villain? He's more of like a tragic, character. How do you see the Mole Man in that sense?
Pretty much as you say.
Yeah.
At first, I mean, he's a little embittered by the rejection and ostracism he experienced because of his strange, shriveled, gnomish appearance.
And he can barely see, too.
Right.
Yeah.
So he burrowed down underground to get away from humankind, lucked into a bunch of, discarded deviant technology and the servant race of moloids that he found down there. So at first he used all of this to strike back at the surface world, the surface world that he
and all
felt
those
had
old
rejected
Atlas
him.
monsters he controls as well.
Right, which were also retconned and explained as genetic experience by the race, experiments by the race of the deviants.
Ah, yes.
But then, after a while, he kind of mellowed on that and just wanted to rule in peace in his little subterranean realm.
Yeah.
And he's actually been an ally to surface heroes at times.
Thank you, sir. Well done. Now, issue 89, Pepper seems to finally get the idea that Tony doesn't want her, which, of course, is a ruse. He does, but he feels he can't. She seems to move towards Happy. The Melter appears again. Issue 91, we wanted to be the first to know. We eloped. We're Mr. and Mrs. Happy Hogan now. That marriage will not last. That will fall apart down the road a bit, and Pepper and Tony will move back towards each other. In the future episodes, we'll talk about other women like Bethany Cave that Tony was involved in. That's in the future. Issue 92, within the vastness of Vietnam. So Tony returns to the place where Iron Man was born, and he ends up in a confrontation with a communist scientist named Half-Face, who I think is scarred or something from some situation he experienced. And the Half-Face in the subsequent issues restores the Titanium Man to fight Iron Man. Issue 94, the classic cover, The Tragedy and the Triumph. Greatly hyperbole. And the Half-Face kind of repents, renounces his communist ways, and the Titanium Man is defeated once again. Now, this is all colon artwork, by the way. Issue 95, I've always found an amusing character, Jasper Sitwell, who is the sort of plucky, flag-waving, sort of idealistic, rose-colored glasses shield agent. We all know who Sitwell is, right?
Oh, yeah.
Don't think of the Sitwell in the movie. It's a very different interpretation of the character. He becomes the shield liaison to Stark Industries. So he becomes a supporting character. The Great Gargoyle appears, we talked about in our Thor spotlight. Again, villains crossing over. And his goal is to gain a cobalt weapon Stark has created that he feels he could use to gain Mjolnir, because he feels the hammer can give him immortality. And then he petrifies Iron Man into stone, which is, of course, his power. And this is classic Marvel Silver Age. So Iron Man's falling off a roof, and he's going to shatter because he's stone. And Sitwell hurriedly moves a dump truck underneath him full of sand, So the petrified Iron Man falls into the sand. Voila, he doesn't break up into a million pieces. And the Great Gargoyle is defeated, but Iron Man, because his suit is draining, he passes out. And the cliffhanger is, will Jasper remove the helmet? We should mention, by the way, when you read the Fraction Iron Man, he does a terrifying story with the Great Gargoyle, where he basically turns a bunch of Paris to stone. It's an awesome story. He realizes the full terrifying potential of that villain, essentially. Issue 97 is in Son of Origins. And if you could call up that cover, please, brother. And this introduces another sort of major Iron Man rogue, Whiplash, who we saw a sort of a bastardized version of in the second Iron Man film.
That's a good word for it.
Yeah.
And this also, not an introduction, but this is also where I was first exposed to the Magia, which is Marvel's version of the Mafia. And that's what, it's the Magia, right?
Magia.
It's the Marvel organized crime villain, essentially. And classic, like when I look at this cover of Tales of Suspense 97, to me that's like the definitive Iron Man. That armor, that look, the pods on the side. I mean, it's such fantastic colon artwork. And this is the second Iron Man comic I ever read, in Son of Origins. And Sitwell is trying to get the helmet off. He can't. And then Morgan Stark, working for the Magia because he's in debt to them from his gambling, he bluffs his way into the factory, and he's going to bring the immobilized Iron Man to the Magia. And he puts Iron Man in the back of the sedan, and Iron Man goes, well, actually, I'll read it to you because it's just classic. Let me pull it up here. All right. Forgive me. Okay. My universal recharger wire can draw new energy from any power source if I can just manage to open my chest plate and pry it loose. There, I got it. Luckily, there's a cigarette lighter back here which works electronically. It doesn't have enough power to restore me to full strength, but it's better than nothing. Morgan never suspected it actually helped me by bringing me into this car. I can feel the life flowing back to me. The cigarette lighter, fantastic. Now, issues 98 to 99.
Oh, one moment, please.
Oh, Murd, please.
One more little detail about number 97. Somewhere in the midst of all that stuff you were just describing happening, we're introduced to, well, maybe not as such, but the character that we will eventually know as Whitney Frost. Speaking
Well
of
done.
love interest for Iron Man, that's a good example.
A very disturbed love interest for Iron Man.
When we first see her, she's kind of the unwilling, a chief of the Nefarious family of
Yes.
the Magia.
And we'll find out exactly, Murd, that in issues 98 to 99, they bring Iron Man to the Magia have a floating headquarters. It's like a pleasure yacht out in international waters. They have gambling and so forth. And they're trying to pry the secrets of the armor. And then Advanced Idea Mechanics, more on them later, ladies and gentlemen, attack because they want to get their hands on Iron Man's armor. Just quickly, of course, we all know that AIM is a cabal of like subversive scientists and their minions who wear I think one of the all-time great Kirby designs, the yellow cone-shaped helmets with the mesh screen they look out of, and like the yellow
heads.
jumpsuits. Did Brian Deemer make the costume out
Yes,
of that?
he did.
And he did a
Which I remember
fantastic
being
job on
amazing.
it.
Yeah. And AIM has appeared sometimes. Their costumes would be like purple and white, and Captain America drew them too. But usually it's the classic yellow garb. And I can't wait to talk about MODOKs down the road. Anyway, they attack. They sink the Magia ship. And then they capture Iron Man. He defeats Whiplash, but then he's taken in by AIM. Now, this is where things get a little tricky, if you're a reader at the time, I can imagine. In '68, Marvel finally breaks free from the deal they have with Independent News /DC. They get their own distributor, Curtis Circulation, because Marvel Comics are selling in great numbers now. And now they can explode with more titles. So they dump all of the house titles. So Tales of Suspense becomes, with issue 100, Captain America. We all know the famous cover of Cap running towards us with the Black Panther and Sharon Carter and so forth. So where does Iron Man go? First, he goes to a one-shot called Iron Man and the Submariner #1, because in Tales to Astonish, that became the Hulk's book with issue 102. And now the Submariner's cut loose. They put them both as one-shot, which I've owned the book a couple times in inventory. You don't see it that often in back issue bins, at least in my experience.
I never even knew it existed.
Oh, yeah. Scripted by Archie Goodwin, colon art. And they continue the story from Tales of Suspense 99. Iron Man defeats Whiplash, and this story is seized by AIM.
Well, now it also lists here Roy Thomas as a writer on that as well.
Oh, maybe you plotted it then, perhaps.
Perhaps,
That's very
yeah.
possible, yep. Because by that point, Thomas is doing a lot of scripting and assistant editing and so forth. And then this goes in then, if you could call up Iron Man 1, please, Shane. Which would be our last image of the evening. And from Iron Man Submariner 1, Submariner again gets his own book with the classic John Buscema cover. I'm sure you're all familiar with standing there, majestic, holding the trident. He gets his own book. And then Iron Man, this is all 1968, he gets his own title called The Invincible Iron Man. Now that, to me, that is a classic Gene Colan cover.
Yep.
And let me tell you something, this book, I've owned it a couple times as a retailer. It just gets more and more expensive. I mean, it's the first #1 Iron Man issue.
Yeah.
And especially since the movie, it just skyrockets in value. When you find this book in high grade, it's a pretty penny. I don't have the Overstreet from it. I don't remember the exact price range at the moment, but you're looking at some money there for that. But in that story, Whitney Frost is, as Murd mentioned, is revealed as the leader of the Magia, and she'll later, of course, become
Madame Mask.
Madame Mask, exactly. Who Fraction did wonderful work with when he incorporated her into his run on Iron Man in the 2000s. And now in this story, the Magia, AIM has created duplicates of the Iron Man armor, but they're not as perfected as Tony's is, and he's able to defeat them all. And he tricks the Subversive group then into blowing up their own island headquarters. And that's how that story concludes. That began in Tales of Suspense. And that is where we're going to end our checklist of Iron Man in the Silver Age.
Excellent.
Any comments before I move on to our closing remarks, my friends? Murd, you may have some notes there.
Ordinarily, this is where I'd throw in a couple of key appearances of the character outside of his or her main series. But interesting to note about Tony Stark here. He doesn't seem to socialize very much outside of his core group or clique, namely the Avengers. Because I think that crossover with Namor that we talked about between...
Tales to Astonish 82, yeah.
Right. I think that may be just about the only time in the Silver Age, as we're defining it here, that Tony Stark appeared outside of Tales of Suspense without the other Avengers.
I think that's correct. If not, I'm sure someone will correct us on the forums. The other appearances he had were as just Tony Stark in Nick Fury's Strange Tales, where he appears as
One of the
founders of S.H.I.E.L.D., but not as Iron Man, just as one of the architects of S.H.I.E.L.D. and, of course, one of the primary inventors of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s technology. Pants sounds like an original art comment. Oh my lord.
I'm showing him the original art for Iron Man #1's cover.
So it still exists.
Well, who do you think owns it, Murd?
I don't
We've
know.
mentioned before on the show, writer, Seinfeld, Bizarro.
Oh, David Mandel.
He has the giant-sized
David
X-Men cover,
Mandel.
too, doesn't he?
Yep.
How much is that worth?
Incalculable. Probably...
Five figures, right?
Easily 5 figures.
Yeah.
If it were to go to auction today, I'm pretty sure it gets 6 figures.
Wow.
I mean, Gene
amazing.
Colan, Iron Man #1 cover. Are you
Yeah.
kidding me?
When you look at Colan's pencil work, before it's inked, it's so beautiful. And similarly, look at John Buscema's work before it's inked. Just incredible. The attention to detail, the dynamism, the anatomy. Oh, it's so gorgeous.
Yeah. But yeah, it's good to see that cover exists, and it's available to view online. You can look at it online.
I'll take it.
Yeah.
Now, one other thing I wanted to mention before we go to our closing comments, I have to mention other media, because let's go full circle. We started with the theme at the beginning of our episode, 1966, the Grant Ray Lawrence cartoons. So again, Marvel contract with Grant Ray Lawrence. Basically, all they did was they took photocopies, of Don Heck art, Jack Kirby art, Steve Ditko art, Gene Colan art, and they gave it very, very modest animation. The mouths would move, an occasional limb, a background. And they made 13 episodes of, each one was 21 minutes long, of the Hulk, Submariner, Iron Man, Captain America, and who am I forgetting? Thor, thank you. And the Avengers appeared in some of these stories as well. I think the X-Men have appeared in one of them too. And this is my first exposure to Iron Man, was these cartoons. They played in the late 70s in reruns on WPIX, Channel 11 from New York. And I have a lot of them today on DVD, bootlegs and so forth I picked up at shows over the years or from IDES or what have you. That jazzy theme you played is one of my all-time favorite cartoon themes because it's so utterly absurd. And I mean, it's like, you know, the jazzy Tony Stark with the cocktail and like the woman on the arm and, you know, in the sports car. But the best part of all this for me, the voice of Tony Stark in Iron Man, Pants is already breaking up, is played by John Vernon, who is immortal to me as, that it's double secret probation.
Animal House. Yep.
Every year the trees are filled with toilet paper. And the toilets explode. Who delivered the medical school cadavers to the alumni dinner? I mean, the man, like this guy, like the Shakespearean voice is delivering with a straight face some of the most ridiculous lines ever in a movie. And like, it's amazing. He was also the mayor in Dirty Harry. Fantastic. But I love that the guy must have needed work because he also was the voice of the Submariner in those shorts as well. So it's, if you guys haven't seen these cartoons, just watch one. Just treat yourself. It's just 21 minutes. Just watch one. Because, you know, it's just moving like this and like an arm.
If I can sit through the John Ogden Stiers Justice League movie, I can sit through 21 minutes of Iron Man.
You get to see like these great masters, Heck, Colin, Kirby, their artwork. It's their artwork, which I'm sure they got nothing for because it was all work for hire. But like the Thor cartoon, which I especially loved, you get to see Kirby's Rainbow Bridge and all the gods and Balder and Odin gesturing grandiose with one stiff arm like this. It's great stuff. Now to close here, I want to ask you guys, as we reflect on the Silver Age and the foundations of Iron Man, how do you feel that's carried over now in this colossal MCU Iron Man property that we have today that's so dominant? I mean, do you think they did the character justice when it comes to his origin? Do you think they took it in a very different direction? What are people's reflections on that?
I don't think they took Tony Stark and Iron Man in a different direction.
Yeah.
I think they just modernized it to fit our perspective.
I'm going to go against you there, Shane, actually. I agree that they updated the origin, certainly, but...
He was a billionaire playboy who could care less about anybody. He got hurt. He had a piece of equipment to fix him, and he created the Iron Man suit. It's pretty much the same thing as the original origin.
Well, those are the facts. Well, I'm talking about the way the Tony Stark's personality is portrayed. I mean, the arrogance is there, but there's I don't know how to describe what exactly is what defines Robert Downey Jr.'s version of the character. It just seems like there's something almost pathological to the way he behaves. Like I mentioned earlier, he's almost on the autistic spectrum.
I'll agree with that. I think he's definitely quirky.
We have to remember as well, to add to what you're saying, Murd, I think they're also borrowing a lot from how Tony Stark was developed later on as a character. I mean, when we talk about the Bronze Age, that's when you get into the alcoholism, that famous cover, all of that. I mean, I think they're also borrowing a lot from that era of Iron Man when they developed the character for the movie. I see the character as kind of an amalgam of these different elements that they've developed from the Silver Age forward. I agree with you that basics premise, which it's brilliant, it still works. That was there, and then there's a lot of the modernization and the updating and and so forth when it comes to the character and the facets of his personality. But what do you think, Pants?
I'm not going to get in the middle of these two guys over here.
Other comments, though, on the Silver Age or closing thoughts?
I learned a lot, and now I'm very sleepy.
I did my job.
Well, it's getting towards the witching hour. You weren't boring. I don't mean that. We're getting very late in the evening.
I'm still amazed through the entire episode. Murd recalls information at the drop of a hat with no notes, no hesitation, it just boom, it's there. I mean, and people are going to see he's just looking up and it's just recalled.
I count on that.
It's incredible.
Oh, you
Me and
guys.
Pants are at the level of Batman is Bruce Wayne and Mert is, man, existential beyond belief.
I
with that
myself am deeply
information.
jealous.
Yeah,
You can remember issue numbers in a way
Ooh,
that I envy.
numbers. Guy knows first names, last names, mother's maiden name, social security numbers, date
Alien
of birth.
I don't know
Races.
social security numbers because those are numbers.
It's a gift I rely upon. Murray, do you have any closing thoughts on the place of Iron Man in the Silver Age?
Better dead than red.
He's waiting all night to use that.
You might as well start joining the John Birch Society. That was fantastic. Anything else, my friends, or have we shot our bolt?
Bolt is shot.
I'm punched.
I hope we did Iron Man in the Silver Age justice.
I think we did. Now, you teased about at some point, S.H.I.E.L.D., AIM, all that stuff. Do you have anything else you want to tease as far as future projects you're thinking of for this wonderful podcast?
Maybe a couple things. I was thinking of a certain member of the Kree race.
Goodness.
Who I
Okay,
think
all right.
deserves a treatment, and actually that would involve more than one person because of who that character is today, actually. And we've been talking about with Danielle. Although I'm waiting.
Oh, yes, that's correct.
I'm waiting to hear from. I want to get Peter's blessing before, but we have another project in mind that, shall we say, will redress a series of spotlights that were never completed.
That's correct.
Some years ago.
Again, this is only a tease.
Yes.
Don't take this for granted. I can't believe we're actually putting this out in the air, but
Don't look for it next
don't
month.
hold us to it. We're not under
Oh,
contract
these-
here.
These take some time.
Oh,
But
sure.
they're a labor of love.
Yes, they are. All right. Well, once again, this episode is brought to you by...
The Collection Drawer Company and their flagship product, the Drawer Box Storage System. Visit their website, collectiondrawer.com, to read more about it and how you can order them to reorganize your collection today.
Yes.
Visit us at comicgeekspeak.com to send an email. The address is comicgeekspeak@gmail.com. To leave a voicemail, the number is 267-702-6642. Stop by thecomicforums.vanillaforums.com and let us know what you think of the spotlight. Correct us on anything we might have gotten wrong. Follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook. Thanks to everyone who contributes to the episodes and listens and posts on the forums and sends stuff and is happy as a clam. And as always, we are uniting the world's mightiest heroes one listener at a time.
Want to stop it? The video?
Yeah, I guess I should.